And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there tonight in the Ideas Room. And of course, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it's getting really crazy. You got world wars.
Yes.
You've got pandemics.
Mm-hmm.
You've got people talking very loosely about using nukes.
Mm-hmm.
You have
almost as if it's inevitable, which really disturbs me.
Yes. When have you heard that kind of talk? Probably not since the Reagan era.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. But they need to bring this back in because, as we've discussed in the last couple of episodes, they need the emergency powers, because the emergency powers, you get under the pesky Constitution and all those different things that we've established in society over hundreds of thousands of years. Tonight's episode, X-Series 121, this is Atlantean DNA, and this is where we're headed. And it has all to do with the elite search for the Cayce visions of the early Atlanteans and the things, or automatons, and how this whole picture came about, including the appearance in the readings of Amilius. And Amelius becomes a very important figure as we go through this. This episode ties in heavily with our Hot Zone episodes in the series about the hidden ruins there in the Bahamas relating to Atlantis. But I'll tell you, it is the grand setup for the X-Series 4th anniversary episode, which is coming up 2 weeks from today. So what's the date on that?
The 18th and the 19th. We're going to do a
it's
double
a two-parter.
Mm-hmm.
It's a two-parter. Fantastic. So you're going to want to stay tuned for that. And we're going to make sure we're going to have some surprise guests. We're going to have some very kind of mind-blowing pieces of information to impart for that episode. But you can really look at this one as setting that whole system up. So we're going to really go for it tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be taking your questions. I want to remind everyone in the second part of the program. And Miss Olivia is going to be putting those together, so you can even ask them right now if you want, and she'll have them all as part of our second act. How's the temperature out there?
People are in a great mood. I don't know how.
See, that's impressive. That's impressive too, and that's the spirit, really. How are you? How do you mean?
Well, everybody's just very upbeat, and they have maintained their sense of humor somehow through all this.
It is remarkable. It is remarkable. Our prayers for people involved in these deep state wars, and there are no good guys, and the bad guys are plentiful enough. But I think what we're seeing, like we saw with the State of the Union address with Stepford Biden, is a level of insanity operating in Washington that we haven't seen before. And we've got 3 years of this administration left, although I don't think Stepford Biden will last that long.
Nope.
He's not even in charge, really.
Mm-hmm.
But their plan basically is to ratchet up the Russia-Ukraine war as a way for them to clamp down on everybody else's freedoms. Doesn't work like that, and they're going to find out painfully hard, just like they were about to find out with the COVID and the lapse thereof of any factual backup for those guys. A lot of these narratives from Pfizer and everything else have been falling apart. And it's been on major display now. It's kind of impossible to hide stage. So, in fact, you notice, Olivia, we're getting a little flicker on the lights.
Yes.
That's interesting. Hopefully we make it through tonight. If not, I promise you we'll restart. But that is kind of fascinating because the way that I look at it, and, weird Nancy's behavior, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, just dancing behind this craven president, and then them sending Kamala Harris over to Warsaw. I mean, this is somebody who just doesn't know anything about foreign policy. Unfortunately, it would be nice if she did. But so we have a real stooge show there at the top. It seems seemingly by design. And this is the nature of the position that we're in. But I think the whole cause of it is this system that's been moving in. And, all the things that we've been seeing in relation to Putin as well, his heavy-duty aggression against the Ukrainian people. And, in Ukraine, I think it's very hard to tell what's taking place on the ground. There's been so much misinformation. There's been 5-year-old videos showing Russian troops and Russian bombers going in. So that's a problem. And what I don't like is that the mainstream media is picking up on it. They're probably the ones who are proliferating it, in fact. And this goes back to some central rules around dark journalism that I have, which is the official story, and then the secondary story, and then the junk underneath, the junk conspiracy. And so what we're seeing is they're trying to make people go to that official story because the weird things that they're putting out there and then debunking themselves. So, you put out a crazy wild story, the internet picks up on it, and then you say, oh, the internet is full of misinformation. So this is their gamble. This is their state of mind, that they need a way to shut down the alternative media and voices like ours and here in the ideas room. They need to shut down these conversations because if you get people to really think, they're not going to want to go along with wars. They're not going to go along with anti-constitutional restrictions, and they're going to demand their country and their sovereignty back. It's inevitable. So their goal, which is right out there in the open, is anyone who disagrees can be ostracized from the general society. So they're headed there. Let's see how far they get. Tonight, in any case, we are looking at an area which we've cultivated very often in this program, which has to do with our ancient past, but the kind of super secrets that reside there in relation to the advanced technology and the clashes that took place. And some of those forces in the mystery schools that gave us all that information between the 19th and the 20th century, they've been holding on to that for a long time. But I have to say, we have to remember that they're also very, very deeply involved in the entire political process. And that's something that Rudolf Steiner was very fond of telling his students, which is that all of the top level American politicians knew the secret society signs, the secret society handshakes, far beyond just, hey, they're Masons. That was the least of the problem in this case. These were very, very deep mystery schools. And those mystery schools had really come out of the closet, in a sense, by 1875 with the advent of the Theosophical Society. And this was all in Steiner's version of events, which I trust the most in that period, the kind of mystery school wars between 1840 and 1875. That was all as a result of the scientific materialism taking over in this period. And they had seen that everything was being reduced and that the spiritual side was going to be carved and cut so that a human being would walk around with only a sense of what a scientific mind would have and the spiritual side completely cut off. And this is pretty much where we've arrived at, in fact. But they deduced it was going to be so bad that within 100 years, they wouldn't recognize humanity. So they decided to let out many of these long-held secrets. And it was a very vocal group inside that wanted to do this and took a leadership role. And the mystery schools that became public as a result, Theosophy and Anthroposophy in particular, but certainly the work of Edgar Cayce and the Gurdjieff work would qualify in that basket as well. So when we look at it, we're looking at a move by a group of people that were behind the scenes saying we need to let some of this information out so people can reacquaint themselves on a soul level with psychic experience, with reincarnation, with sort of the ancient past, the precognitive past. And we started seeing people in the 19th century like Ignatius Donnelly, who was a senator and also a candidate for vice president, really, putting it out there with the antediluvian world. That is a complete book about Atlantis and how there was a major culture there in the Atlantic that fed all these other cultures like the Mayans and the Egyptians. And this was a really well-respected figure. So that kind of information coming out in the same window is quite remarkable. But the most remarkable piece was that of Theosophy and Helena Blavatsky coming out. So this happened in 1875 that Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Alcott, along with Emma Britton, founded the Theosophical Society here in America. And this is crucial because it turned out that Blavatsky was the trade-off figure from all these different things that were happening in that, say, mystery school wars that we were witnessing. And the basic gist was, we can't let this information out because people will abuse each other with it. It's too advanced for them. And we've seen that before, which is why we kept it secret. And then there was another group saying, if you don't let it out now, these other forces are going to take over and we won't recognize humanity. So when that split occurs, at a certain point, the compromise figure is to allow Helena Blavatsky to take on that world stage. Blavatsky was a natural medium, natural mystic, a kind of which hadn't been seen in hundreds of years. And the groups were very well aware of her. And the split between the groups of being the left-hand schools and the right-hand schools determined loosely, because they all share the same information, but for different goals. And then as we find out through the work of Steiner, extreme right and extreme left as well. And when you go extreme left, that's the kind of dark secret society stuff that we're looking at right now in the American political process and across the world. And I guarantee you that the participants in that Davos crowd that we've been witnessing, their hijinks from everything from the COVID op to the UFO threat to the war in Ukraine, that group is very, very deeply steeped in occult language and occult practice and occult background. And I'm sure we would see that if we were looking at someone like Schwab, we could determine exactly what kind of allegiance he owed and which secret society it was. But tonight we're going to look through the lens of Edgar Cayce. And Cayce's fascinating because as an individual, he gives us the best demonstration of a psychic in the 20th century. He's known as the Sleeping Prophet, and he gave a series of some 20,000 readings, 14,000 of which are recorded. And they're just remarkable, many of them medical, where Cayce would go into a trance and being able to diagnose someone at a great distance. Now, over and over again, although he was challenged and doctors observed him and all these different things, no one could ever find any fraud or forgery involved with what he was doing. And doctors would flock to him because they found the information was so erudite and they wanted to know more. And this is how advanced the Cayce work was. And everything that we see now, from yoga being kind of a common practice, chiropractic therapy, so many of these different holistic health modalities all come directly out of Theosophy, Anthroposophy, or the Cayce work. It's just, they have such a presence there. That impact is so felt. Early childhood education, in the case of Rudolf Steiner, the Waldorf schools. There's also biodynamic farming in relation to this. So the mystery schools let out an entire sort of multidisciplinary set of instructions for us. And then they kind of just lay it out there in the culture, which is how they move the culture, is seeing who picks it up and what happens with it. They don't come in as kind of a ruling oligarch of ascended masters. So it's a little bit different. But in the case of Edgar Cayce, it seems like after Theosophy went wrong, which is what took place after Blavatsky died, there was a big vacuum. And according to Steiner, they had decided that they were going to work along a totally different line. And I believe that that line that these mystery schools decided to work with in the Western tradition was through the figure of Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce would go on to give these readings on Atlantis, which set out in detail in a way that Anthroposophy and Theosophy really didn't, even though they wrote extensively about it. And I would say that Cayce added things to that picture and filled it out and gave it real, it gave us a real sort of snapshot of the whole thing through his own connection to it. And it was so remarkable and so strange at the time. We're talking about the 1920s, and they didn't discuss things like that. But there he was talking about television and atomic energy and all these things that the Atlanteans possessed. This is what's so crucial when we look at the Cayce work, is that incredible legacy left behind, as in the Steiner work, that they were looking out across time and they could sort of catch that snapshot of where we'd be in this period, looking at 2022. And in fact, Steiner had said around 1920 that in 100 years we were going to get an opportunity, because he felt that the mystery schools were failing. And he said, in 100 years, there's going to be an opportunity for anthroposophy and spiritual science and the mystery school work to come forward again. So he saw the opportunity, and here we are, faced with incredible crisis in world affairs, and yet this information which was laid out and brought forward by these schools, now we have possession of so much of it and can utilize it if we can read the tea leaves, in a sense, and get to the bottom of it. And we can do that through the help of the work that they left behind and being able to interpret it properly. Part of this work in the thrust of anthroposophy and theosophy and Cayce has to do with land rising. And this is very important, which is things are rising now. And that's going to be a big hint that something existed a long time before recorded history. Recorded history is kind of a joke, the way that it's portrayed now. And so we're in a kind of a period of enlightenment around this, where even within a few years, many of the things that we say taking place now in terms of accounting for those history aren't going to make any sense. And we've seen this in the case of findings like Göbekli Tepe and others, that the people who were saying the situation with humanity goes back a lot further, and Cayce got there real early on this, they were right. And the people who were clinging to, oh, archaeology is the sacred science and all the rest, and they wanted to keep their version of Egyptology that they developed in the 18th century without any of the technological tools, well, that really kind of speaks for itself. They wanted that position and authority, and they wanted that story, and they were obligated to keep that story, because part of the big keys around this is humanity is not supposed to discover these things. And so that's where we're going tonight. Why is it that so many of these things have been obscured, not just through ignorance? So what's the other piece on this? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here in X Series 121. We're going deep on Atlantean DNA and the Cayce visions, that elite search to find out through the Cayce information about Amilius, Belial, and the Atlantean powers. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program, and Miss Olivia is putting those together now. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter, because we've really, we've gone through incredible censorship, and we're seeing it more and more. And I anticipate that the Russia-Ukraine crisis is going to be utilized as a big excuse to shut down dissenting voices or anyone who questions. No doubt. We're already seeing it, right? Mm-hmm. Amazing. And that becomes so obvious. Actually, they shut down RT America because it's Russian funded. Mm-hmm. But in fact, it's kind of absurd. It's like saying, hey, if Britain went to war, all these people would shut down the BBC. I mean, they're news organizations, and that they're state funded. So what's the problem? You can sift through any of that. But no, they have to be thrown out.
It's not just that. They want to cancel everybody yes. Who's Russian. Right? There was some opera singer who's Russian, and she's supposed to make a stand and right. denounce Putin and everything. Yeah. And, people have family there, and, yes. Dissidents get thrown in prison. It's very dangerous for them to stand up and say anything, but there's no nuance. There's no shades of gray. It's, what did W say? You're either with us or you're with the terrorists, right? That's it. It's all black and white.
What he should have said was, you're with the oil companies mm-hmm. or you're with the banks. It's so much of the world is carved on what they did after 9/11. I'm glad you mentioned mm-hmm. W, because so much of the kind of fascist activity around Biden about the domestic terrorists mirrors what Bush did in calling everyone that he didn't agree with him Al-Qaeda. But where they kind of put that angle out and said, we're going to grab every terrorist from every place, and we're going to shut off their money, and we're going to drone strike them and all these types of things, even if they're American citizens. We saw them do that. They turned that whole Al-Qaeda thing around, and they turned it on the United States citizens. And that's what we're looking at now. And it can't be allowed to happen, because, they've been instructed in those back rooms that, like, hey, if we hit them with this during a crisis, they won't know what hit them, and we'll just do it this way. I mean, the fact that you raise the awareness level and call it out and protest on it, and protest is supposed to be something that's only, reserved for Justin Trudeau against this aggression when he is prosecuting his own truckers in the country. I mean, the hypocrisy runs
with no bail.
With no bail.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are these freedom-loving democracies? I don't think so. So before I rush into this, do you have any questions?
Well, we could start with Cayce 101.
Yes.
Okay, Patricia Blue wants to know, is there a book specifically about Cayce's Atlantis work?
Yeah, I mean, one of the best, really the best, is Edgar Cayce on Atlantis. And that's a book from 1968 that really started a real earthquake. And it's the same year, coincidentally, that the Bimini Wall was found, which was predicted by Cayce as something that would show up on a schedule. And he predicted that in 1943 and said, expect it in 68 or 69, not so far away. In 1968, J. Manson Valentine shows up and finds it, but he finds it with the help of a very interesting pilot that I spoke to recently, Trig Adams. And Trig Adams is going to figure in very importantly over the next couple of weeks here. We have an important interview with him coming up. But Trig, if you were watching The Colonel in the Hot Zone, he is the son of Margaret Sanders and the grandson of the Colonel himself. But those original finds around the Bimini Wall, Trig had found this large structure by Andros, and that led to all the searching around Bimini. And so Valentine's find of Bimini is connected directly with Trig, who was a very young pilot. I think he was like 25 years old. And his mother developed something called MARS, which was the Marine Archaeological Research Society. And what happened was I got very curious about his mother and the things that she had done in all of this extensive trying to find Atlantis. And so we put that all together in an episode for you. One thing I didn't get around to in that episode, which is going to be key for this one, is the presence of a group down there in the hot zone called Rockwell International. And I'm going to put some of this information about Rockwell together on this. But to wrap that question up, Edgar Cayce on Atlantis, it's written by Edgar Evans Cayce, who was Cayce's son, who was an engineer and had life in Atlantis. A very interesting guy. I was lucky enough to meet him, and he was a remarkable person. One thing I can say is that his general knowledge on the subject helps the book dramatically, being Cayce's son and an engineer and having that background in Atlantis. And interestingly enough, that's the book that got John Lennon very, very hooked on the Atlantis thing. And when he looked into it, he started to see, there's going to be land rising, and he bought lots there in the Atlantic for when Atlantis was going to rise, as we've outlined in the Hot Zone shows. Of course, others did it as well, people like Ernest Hemingway's brother, Les. And there were a lot of people around this Hot Zone land rising piece. And it's going to become more and more important as time goes by. You don't hear a lot about it in the media now. This is something that they downplay dramatically because they're keeping an eye on it. But one of the things that we started the year off with, I said we have to watch for land rising. Land rising is so crucial because this is something that's a tenet or a teaching inside the mystery schools about this period and what's going to happen and the dramatic changes. But they pointed us directly to this period. Not 300 years in the future, 400 years in the future. The land's rising now. It's something we're going to observe here. So much so that people got that message sort of in advance. And you see this frenzy around the 70s and the 80s of people jockeying for positions for it, and it doesn't happen. Well, the timing, the clock on that hadn't come about. Some of it had shifted or had risen. And that's where you got findings like the Bimini Wall, et cetera. Now, Rockwell is very interesting because I found them by accident. This is a letter to Hugh Lynn Cayce, who's Cayce's other son, and ran the ARE, the Association for Research and Enlightenment. They were lucky, they were nice enough, I was lucky enough, to be sent this letter that Trig had sent Hugh Lynn. And ordinarily, I would have had to have gone to Virginia Beach for this, which I would love to do, but it was so much easier that they sent me the letter because it's not part of the membership. So this is from Trig Adams, and this is October 1969, just about a year after the Bimini Wall was found. And Trigg writes to Hugh Lin, this is the actual letter, so everybody's on the same page. Trigg writes to Hugh Lin, it's come to my attention that Colonel Rockwell, head of the North American Rockwell Corporation, is a member of ARE. A subsidiary of that company has recently been acquiring large areas of Bimini and islands south for development, much like those suggested in the Cayce readings. I am led to believe that the readings provided the impetus for this action, although I doubt that at the corporate level this is widely known, if at all. I was hoping you might be able to give us some information on this if it's not supposed to be a secret and you know of any. Also, it would be possible to arrange an introduction to the colonel and so on. So this is quite fascinating. It was one of those little pieces that was hanging out there, and there's always been a group, AUTEC, around Andros, and AUTEC, basically the underwater Area 51. They're doing so many different secret experiments. It's actually a much better place to test out alien aircraft than Area 51 because nobody really knows much about it, and it's underwater, for heaven's sake. But their position there on Andros, so close to Bimini, I think is quite telling. But one of the fascinating pieces, and I'm going to go into this history of Rockwell as part of that two-part episode we have coming up on the 18th, which I want everyone to be there for our 4th year anniversary show. And it's the anniversary of the X series. That'll be episode 122. And next week, we're going to do an interview. So as I was going through the various things that they were involved in, guess what? They were directly involved in developing the engines for the Apollo moon program. Also, the son of Willard Rockwell, who started this all, they were from Boston, interestingly enough. Interesting place, huh? And the son, it turns out, went to Pennsylvania State. And he would have been about 24 years old at the same time as Cayce had said that parts of the Firestone or Two-Eye Stone from the Atlanteans that had been brought from Yucatan to Pennsylvania would have been right there, available at the university. So this is very interesting and lends more credence to this because Rockwell got out ahead of everybody. In fact, in the 1980s, they were the #1 defense contractor in the world, outdoing Lockheed and Boeing. And eventually Northrop Grumman swallowed them up. But quite a remarkable background, and we're going to get more into it. But this idea that this Rockwell International goes into Bimini, buys up Cat K, and starts doing all of this technological sort of wizardry enough to launch the Apollo program in the 1960s, got those kind of bells ringing a little bit because, again, we're looking at the advent of the knowledge of this Two-Eye Stone and how it relates to how that impacted our technology. And I'm fond of pointing out that there was a NASA scientist who in the 70s got very interested in this concept of the Two-Eye Stone. And again, Tuaoi is the spelling on this. It's an unusual word that Cayce emphasized when speaking about the Atlanteans and the power station that they used. And this was a towering crystal that was held in a building where they would roll back a dome. This thing would come out and power all these other firestones. And the firestones could be as small as, an iPhone, basically, or a satellite dish, and then the bigger ones and the bigger ones and so on. And the way that Cayce described it is he said, well, it's a central power station, lights up everything else. You've got crafts on top of the water. You have crafts underwater. You have crafts that can fly through things, crafts that can fly through mountains, for example. This is quite remarkable. And he talks about basically satellite activity being powered. And he talks about them taking photography at a distance through things, X-ray photography. So these Atlanteans, unfortunately, and this is where the Association for Research and Enlightenment gets spooked in their own work, really, because they're afraid of what Cayce says, because what Cayce says is incredibly risque. And here's an organization, trying to sort of maintain this credibility as a psychic organization that has a kind of a spiritual mission, and they've done quite well, I think, in that regard. But they get very nervous, and they don't know how to promote Cayce's Atlantis work, which I feel is the most vital work in the entire Cayce canon. Because,
especially now.
Yeah, timing-wise, just remarkable. But they have a thing of like, well, we don't know about that, but and I understand that. I'm not actually criticizing them. I'm saying that in terms of the actual research on the Cayce work on Atlantis, this has not been done in depth. There have been a few researchers. Some people drop in on it, right? They're looking around and they come across Cayce. But I'm talking about using the Cayce work as the actual compass when coming into this work. And Cayce's work on this is so edgy. At a certain point, he starts describing how in Atlantis, these groups of scientists who were kind of against the initiates, the initiates coming from the Amelius side of Atlantis. And Amelius is this being, it's almost like a Christ figure. And Amelius in the readings shows up as somebody who tries to encourage them to use this knowledge and use the two-eye stone for spiritual purposes. And they develop all these temple rites based around the idea of interacting with the technology to communicate with the outer spheres and, the saint realm, getting those messages from the spiritual. So I'm fond of saying it's like popping open your laptop and there's an ascended master in there. This is how they were looking at it. But another group develops on a different line, and this is the Belial group. And the Belial group sees the same things going on with the two-eye stone, but they realize it has incredible physical impact. So that, yes, they can interact with these beings, but you can also use it as a laser and, take over the neighboring islands and things like that. And Belial's Belial, there's an echo of this in the Bible later, which is the Baal worship, Baal. And there's all kinds of things associated with Baal, human sacrifice, and sacrifice for crops, and this type of thing. And it is the graven image in the Bible over and over again that this comes up. Belial, this early version, the way that Cayce talks about it, there's a war that develops between the Amelius group, who are of the laws of one, and this Belial group. And eventually the Belial group, what they need to do is to start to emulate the Amelius group. They need to emulate them on a physical basis. And they decide that they need to kind of take over by being more like them and sort of integrate themselves in that way. And so what they do is they start to develop a way, you can't describe the process as anything else, in my opinion, than cloning. They didn't talk about cloning in Cayce's era, but what he's describing sounds very much like cloning to me. And they create these beings, and the beings are, as they go to project these beings, apparently the Amelius group had the ability to project out of themselves. And remember, this is why Cayce's story is so fantastic. The cosmology around it is so fantastic. It's in a period where we're talking about these Atlanteans that are supposed to be exceptional. They have exceptional mental capabilities. They have powerful telepathy. They can move things with their mind. And they can create things by focusing on them. So it's a different type of human being. You could say that maybe we have those talents innately, but they're not manifested. And so when we hear about the Atlanteans and the things that the initiates can do, we're talking about a different order of person. These are very highly advanced spiritual beings. So the Belial group decides that they need to develop this ability to project things into matter as well. So they go about infiltrating and, basically trying to emulate this Amelius group. And some of the things that Cayce was getting in those readings were coming directly from people coming to him and saying, I want to know all about my past lives. And this is quite remarkable because Cayce was a Sunday school teacher, and reincarnation, even now when you talk to certain Christians who, it's just not taught, although it was originally in there. There's some key passages even in the Bible, for example, when the disciples approach Christ and they say, is it true that Elijah has come and Elijah is going to come back? And he says, oh, Elijah came already and they beheaded him. And then the disciples say, oh, they understood he was talking about John the Baptist. So there are references in there to reincarnation. So, all those things are for someone to figure out for themselves. But the idea that, Origen basically stripped out of the Bible text any reference to reincarnation is pretty powerful. It's pretty compelling. And I think any Christian who looks at that material would see it that way. So very often the people who study the mystery school output have a strong sense of Christianity, but they're esoteric Christians because they believe Christ had many lives and then built up to this point where he became Christ. So, these are different pieces of a puzzle over time. But interestingly enough, when we go back and we look at this sense of reincarnation, this is where Cayce, when he's speaking and talking about it, it's getting so much information. It's from the individual subconscious who are coming to him for these readings. And they are remarkable. And we have to remember that the kind of pinpoint accuracy that Cayce had in relation to his medical readings, when we start to think of things like the Atlantis readings, and we think of the accuracy involved, you have to say, if you go back there and read those things from like 1925, 100 years later, when we look back at it now, so much of it has come to pass, including the fact that things just keep getting older, as Graham Hancock says. And right now, even traditional history has to admit that their bogus, 5,000 BC Samaria origin for humanity doesn't really cut it for civilization, because you have Göbekli Tepe, which is already a very advanced culture that's 12,000 years old that they found in Turkey. So everything, all the dating starts to match up more with what Cayce was saying. So when those researchers came forward in the 90s, in the early 2000s, saying, hey, look, the Sphinx is as old as what Cayce said because it's got weather, it has certain types of weathering on it that only come from rain, and it wasn't raining around here since 10,000 BC. So this thing was built in 10,000 BC. By the way, the archaeoastronomy shows it lines up with Leo. So, the Sphinx is a lion. Start putting these things together. So we start to get into this awareness piece that we know there was something else going on there, but we had a very limited idea of history, and we still do. Through the mystery schools and through the work of somebody like Cayce, we're getting a totally different impression of what was taking place back there. What's crucial is in Cayce's cosmology, these people who were in Atlantis having this fight between the Belial group and the Amelius group are reincarnating now, and that we are facing all the same extremes of that period. And in that period, they destroyed themselves with the two-eye stone, the terrible crystal, and that we're facing off in this period now again. And we have the opportunity to move forward with that high technology or to blow ourselves up. So over and over again, there's that echo in the readings of it's going to be destruction or you're going to move forward into glory. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist series, X series. This is 121. We're going deep into Atlantean DNA and the elite search for Cayce's vision on this. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. I'm going to roll into some very interesting comments that Cayce had to say about the things and the kind of monstrosities that the Atlantean scientists had created in order to group themselves in with that Amelius group. Again, Cayce struggled with his own readings and looking at this material and information. And I have to say, there's so many people who exploit the Cayce work now and say, I'm Edgar Cayce and, I'm the reincarnation. And we have a lot of jokers in the field who do that. But the truth is that Cayce's work didn't really do very much for him in his own lifetime. He wasn't somebody who really sold his services. Very often when people send him money, he'd send the money back and say, if you want to become a member, you can do like a membership thing, but I'm not going to take your money. And not really until the book came out, There Is a River, which was, I think, a year and a half before he died, did he really have any kind of financially stable life. There's a story about Hewlin Cayce coming to visit him, and he's living in Ohio at the time, and he goes to pick him up at a train stop, and he realizes that his father, Edgar Cayce, has newspaper tucked into his coat to keep himself warm. I mean, this is the level that Cayce worked on, and Cayce himself was a photographer by trade. And so we find something with Cayce where the psychic work kept coming up, and it was a compelling reason for him. It was a real vision because the mystery schools were kind of moving him into this, including the fact that at different times in his life, this mysterious figure would appear. And the figure was definitely kind of looked like an Eastern guru type. But those are different and interesting visions that he was having. But certainly the readings themselves indicated that the schools were moving him into position. And they eventually would bring him to Virginia Beach, Virginia, to do the work. And he struggled a great deal there as well. And when he showed up in Virginia Beach, it was just a fishing village. And there weren't even that many houses there. So it's quite interesting that the readings took him to that exact spot. There's also a real tie-in with the Great White Brotherhood. And he, at one point, said that Virginia Beach was the only port of the Great White Brotherhood, which is very unusual. And the Great White Brotherhood being that real central mystery school from which, we get so much of the kind of spiritual impulse. So when I'm looking over the history of Atlantis with Cayce, I think it's important for us all to keep in mind that when he's discussing what they're doing and the projection that they're doing, that the way that we would estimate that now would be the types of experiments that we do scientifically, because we're projecting different things, like when they're growing an ear on a mouse and other kind of monstrosities and things that they've been dabbling with and mixing, human and animal genes, coming up with the chimera gene and all this kind of thing. We're looking at something where we're moving into a dangerous position with what they're doing with cloning, with using robotics, aborted fetal lines, things of this nature, where they're messing with the human genome and where they're doing gene therapy on a global scale at this point. So the scientific community is completely out of bounds. This is why that echo of those Atlantean scientists doing this really comes up as so pertinent right now, but it's a fascinating story. So let's read some of what they were doing. Now, at times it's come up that we've wondered, these people, they live their lives and you think, you can't take it with you. Like, what are you doing? Somebody like Henry Kissinger, you get to a point, we've just done so many evil things. Like, what's the point to continue to do them? Or somebody like Fauci, who is just hiding right now from all the lies that he perpetrated. But this guy's 80 years old, I mean, is the point just to be greedy into his older years with no regard for anything else? Well, we've thought about this on a deep level, and I've often wondered if in these secret societies, they don't have ways of predicting the reincarnation of these types of individuals, so that somebody like George H.W. Bush, for example, would have a reason to be greedy all the way through the end of his life because he knew he would reincarnate back into that line. But I think that this works on both the left-hand side of things, the more kind of black magic schools, and on the good side, because there's this idea that those who have attained some spiritual enlightenment as an initiate, especially from Atlantis or Egyptian times, bears with them a mark and carries with them a particular mark. I'm going to read a few interesting readings in relation to this. There was one woman who came to Cayce and felt that she bore these marks. And oddly enough, not only does he reinforce it, but it comes up in his own readings about people around his own group. All right, so as far out as this is, let's listen to this for a moment. And remember that Cayce, during this Atlantean Egyptian lifetime, is a high priest named Rata, and that Rata tries very hard to help integrate those who are fleeing Atlantis into Egypt to build the pyramids. And he works for 25 years to do this. And this is where he gets so much of his inspired psychic information later in his later lives. But Rata becomes very important too, because in the readings he's described as not having a human father. So we have to start to wonder about Rata's origins a little bit. But in any case, okay, so she comes to him and she says, what is the meaning of 532, the number on my forehead? Cayce answers, the number as indicated in self in the Atlantean experience is that to which each of these numbers may attain. Question. The mean, a count of numbers found in the Bible, such as a time, times, and half time, which is clearly written on my left eye. What is the meaning of that? Cayce. This is part of the experience in the Yucatan activity as a priestess. Some call it the evil eye. Some call it the surety of the eye. What make you of it? According to that for which you use it, for deeper meaning will be found in your own self. In other words, you can do anything with that. You have a very persuasive, hypnotic eye. What about the double triangle between my eyes at the top of my nose? This is part of the experience to which the entity attained in the building during the period of the mound builders. So this woman is coming in and saying, I have these marks, or how am I getting them? They're mystical marks. She's obviously psychically trained herself. In case he's giving her the key to each one of these symbolic markings. So her body, through these stages of reincarnation, is coming back in with some signifier from her great spiritual attainment one way or another. She's aware of it. He's interpreting it. This came up in relation to his work as Rata, and I'm going to read a reading where someone asks him the question. And they ask him the question, was I given a mark by Rata? If so, where is it and what is the meaning of it? Meaning, in 10,500, when Rata was here as the high priest integrating the failing, sinking Atlanteans, who still had the high tech, into a very kind of low-tech Egyptian culture, very primitive, that these people who were associated with Rata would bear a marking. And he answers, so she, again, the question, was I given a mark by Rata? If so, where is it and what is the meaning of it? The answer, the upper portion of the lip between the nasal passages and the corner of the lip, there exists there at times, especially a feeling there, the messenger, the speaker, to those that need counsel and advice. This is really quite deep and remarkable, because what it's saying is that there's an overhang from these deep mystical experiences in previous lives on that kind of initiatory level. And in the case of Rata, that he had actually given each a different mark to reincarnate with. So it opens up so many different things about how we identify people. I always think about Gorbachev and that remarkable, birthmark that he had on his head. And it was like the most traumatic thing that one could see. You know this about Gorby. And so there's that kind of, it's almost like a tattoo from a different lifetime. And it can be incredibly subtle. As he was saying in this, it was almost like a twitching for this woman of her mouth to speak. And so we need to understand the physical signifiers going on here. And if you go into stories about people being initiated around the mystery schools, you're going to find that very often they'll receive a mark. And now I think if we put these things together, we start to understand why some of these people and some of these groups on the left-hand side might be willing to say, oh, I'm all in for doing all this evil stuff. Because, the whole I can't take it with me thing, not necessarily. Because when they reincarnate with these weird marks, they can prove who they are to these secret societies. Interesting indeed. But tonight we're going through the Amelius part of it, which means we're going for those who are trying to enlighten the culture. And so when they bear the mark, it's basically like a sacred insignia.
Can I throw you a question?
Mm-hmm.
I love this question. Glove arm. If a civilization dies together, do they reincarnate together?
Well, I mean, they have a shared experience for sure.
Well, and there are soul groups, clearly.
Yeah, there's no question about that. The groups that come in together, and you see over and over again, if you study the readings, people working in different lifetimes around the same path. So they might reincarnate in, France during the Renaissance or the Egyptian periods, whatever, but they keep coming in together in different roles, so sometimes they're husband and wife, sometimes they're, father and son, whatever it happens to be, but those roles can change and the sexes involved in those roles can change.
And didn't Cayce say something about the Atlanteans reincarnating in the 20th century?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he said there was a huge influx of them during the World War II period, and that they were going to bring the world to incredible extremes, which is exactly what we're seeing. The more we study Atlantis, I think that the better snapshot we have of the world that we're in. It is, in fact, the Atlantean echo. It's the Atlanteans come around full circle. And the quicker they remember who they are, the better, I would say, in relation to this. All right, more of where the Atlantis readings take us, and then we'll go into Amelius and the development of the Atlantean scientists, which I think takes us into an important place, because so often we've put forward in the episodes around the hot zone very elite groups, the very top scientists, some of the very top people in the world politically and otherwise are very drawn in to this hot zone area for study. We've seen it with Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein, all of that emphasis around having the best scientists and seeking out this Atlantis history. They did it in a very kind of quasi behind the scenes way. We've brought so much of that forward through finding out about Alexander Cousteau. Of course, the Zorro Ranch itself and the many eugenics experiments that Epstein was involved in. These are all related to this Atlantis and Atlantean DNA concept. Back to the Cayce readings. There are a few terms in the present that would indicate the state of consciousness, save that through concentration, the group mind of the children of the law of one, the Amelius group, they entered into a fourth dimensional consciousness, or were absent from the body. Thus, they were able to have the experience of crystallizing through the light, the speech from what might well be termed the saint realm. This is important. Basically, the two-eye stone, the way that they're using it with these priestesses, attaining a level of purity and concentration that they're able to receive those messages. Quote, to impart understanding and knowledge to the group thus gathered. So there's a series of readings where Cayce starts to talk about the Atlanteans and their appearance in Egypt. And what he's always referring to is that they have a big throng group with them that are totally like basically zombie slaves. And he refers to them as automatons. He refers to them as things. He refers to them as untouchables. And the things is very interesting to me. Automaton is a very interesting term as well. It's a suggestion of something that is completely mechanized, that doesn't have a will of its own. And there's some very odd stories. One of them that I found is a story from ancient China. And it's about an automaton, but this is about maybe 400 BC, somewhere in there. The king stared at a figure in astonishment. It walked with rapid strides, moved its head up and down so that anyone would have taken it for a live human being. The artificer touched its chin and began singing perfectly in tune. He touched its hand and it began posturing, keeping perfect time. As the performance was drawing to an end, the robot winked its eye and made advances to the ladies in attendance, whereupon the king became incensed and would have executed this robot basically on the spot. So there's this whole story back there about this unusual being that shows up, and it's emulating, it's a figurine, basically a statue that comes to life. So it turned out to be a construction of leather, glue, lacquer, variously colored white, black, red, and blue. Examining it closely, the king found all the internal organs complete: liver, gallbladder, heart, lungs, spleen, kidneys, stomach, and intestines. And over these again, muscles, bones, limbs, joints, skin, teeth, hair, all of them artificial. The king tried the effect of taking away the heart and found the mouth could no longer speak. He took away the liver and the eyes could no longer see. He took away the kidneys and the legs lost their power of locomotion. So there's this whole unusual story hanging out back there about an imposter being showing up. That's not a real being. And that whole idea is that there's an automaton lineage back there. Well, by the time we get into like the 17th or 18th century, they're creating musical instruments that can play by themselves. So they're automatons. But the phrase that Cayce uses for these things that the Atlanteans bring with them, he refers to them as automatons. So he's, instead of just saying, or they're zombie slaves, he's referring to them as having basically a robotic quality, that they have no will of their own. And there's a great thread in here, if we can get a grasp around it, which is that these beings on the Amelius side who project beings like themselves, they have the ability to do this. And the Belial group wants to do the same thing, and they basically are creating a DNA laboratory in order to create these different types of beings. But their versions of what get created don't have any of the spiritual insight. They're soulless. And so we get into a lot of trouble. Yes.
Everyone is saying Biden is basically an automaton at this point.
He's definitely an automaton. So we're going to get into some suggestion around these. I'm going to try to fill out the picture of these things a little bit more. Use this series of readings here. There is something interesting, which is there are a lot of readings that talk about in the land of Atlantis, a timekeeper for the things or the automatons before Adam. What do you mean before Adam? That's what he says. And this is the weird thing about the readings, is there's a whole series of things that go on before Adam. So we have a very interesting background there about what Adam and Eve and the early echo of all this is about. So he's going again and he's looking at this idea of the automatons. And the question comes up, what is meant by automatons who labored in that experience? Were they individual souls developing, or was it spiritual evolution? And the answer comes back, both and neither. They were the offspring of the sons of God with the daughters of men, or vice versa. Now, there's that echo in the Bible about the sons of God and daughters of men, and the production that comes out of that are these giants, and the giants cause all these wars. So we have a kind of an echo of that Nephilim idea early on here in the Cayce readings. But again, he's talking directly about these automatons. What was the character of the Atlantean teachings that the priest Ra-Ta was called back from banishment to counteract? That those who were without sufficient of the purposes to seek the whole light because of the very influence of the appendages and conditions that had been manifested in material life, such as to make them things, that were to be kept submerged to be used by those with greater abilities. Sounding a lot like clones here, sounding a lot like cyborgs who have been projected into, but are just have no free will. And so then it comes, are they soulless? Or, what Ra-Ta is saying is they have the ability to develop that. So whatever it was that the Atlanteans had done to create these beings, these clones, Ra-Ta is coming back in and saying, I know how to connect that being with its spiritual hierarchy. The priest held that these were one, and that such conditions offered the possibility through which each soul might find a way of escape by and through purifying the body that the Atlanteans had created. So this is very interesting. The priest Ra-Ta comes into Egypt, and the group that he's with takes over Egypt. And then Ra-Ta goes all around during the period of Atlantis sinking, and he spends 25 years with the wise men of Atlantis figuring out where to deposit the records. This is the kind of Cayce setup of the Ra-Ta story. When Rata comes back, he finds Egypt has changed dramatically, and they actually banish him because the Belial Atlanteans have taken over. And later, they call him back because the situation in society has disintegrated dramatically. And one of the first things he does is he changes the policy towards these things, these clones, the automatons that were being abused. Here's another reading around this period. In the Atlantean land, the entity was the timekeeper for those who were called things, or servants, or workers of the people, and the entity felt latent and manifest in the present the wanting to reform or change things, that every individual soul had the right to freedom, felt the need of God's hand in what evil had brought into the earth. See, this was before Adam. So there's a setup there that there's a group, humanity exists long before Adam, but Adam is the first kind of perfected version. And that's where we, in religious, spiritual standards, that's where the story starts. But the story actually goes back a lot further. And what Cayce is suggesting is these two groups that are battling it out will have a tremendous impact on the type of humanity that we get. But there's a piece there where he talks about, now we're bringing it up to 10,500 BC, and the Atlanteans migrating into Egypt. And Egypt is getting overrun because they're bringing with all of these clones, slaves with them. The things. Now, this is very interesting because we get a snapshot of the history. So much of this is buried in mythology, and we hear about, half man, half beast, and really remarkable things, the Greek myths, for example. But here's Cayce talking about it as a political problem, where there's a tremendous, difficult political situation going on in Egypt at the time. These Atlanteans are coming in with these kind of scientific offspring. And later, we're going to find that many groups, like this Rockwell group that I cited, start looking through the Cayce work, and the CIA begins to spy on the ARE, looking for just this kind of information about who the Atlanteans were. And I'm going to relate it back to the type of DNA that they were searching for in relation to this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here on Cayce's vision.
Can I get you to focus in on something for a
Sure.
minute? Okay, so I have 3 related questions.
Okay.
Mike Pannone, were the Atlanteans a pre-Adamic civilization?
Definitely.
Okay.
They started that way. I mean, it's both, the pre and post. So I want to give you one date which we can work with, which is Cayce has Amelius appearing about 100,000 BC. So he is Amelius as Adam, because Cayce always said there were 5 Adams and they appeared in each of the different important centers of culture in Africa and South America, in Atlantis, in North America, and in Asia. So Amelius is simultaneously Amelius in Atlantis, but he's also Amelius as Adam. This is how Cayce refers to him. So after Amelius, we have the post-Adamite civilization, but there's a pre-Adamite civilization in the Cayce work. And one of the things that Amelius is able to do is split the races into male and female, because before they're joined in a single sex. This is a remarkable piece that is a big kind of part of the mystery school teaching. It's very hard through traditional science to bear this out, but this is where the Cayce readings are coming from. Before that, they were joined in the same sex. So they were androgynous, no question about it. So what's the rest of that?
Okay. Parker Deckelman, were the Atlanteans and Anunnaki contemporaries? If so, why didn't the Babylonians mention them?
Well, this is an interesting thing because you have this battle over and over again. Whenever there's ancient ruins found that are advanced, that there's the whole ancient aliens type thing. And that all comes from von Daniken's work. which relates to the idea that all that sophisticated stuff had to come from somewhere, visit here, and then we were able to do it. I think the idea of off-world civilizations visiting here and making things more advanced is definitely true. We've seen enough evidence for it. However, one of the things that we see in the Cayce work is that he relates the high achievement to the incredible traits of these Atlanteans, who are spiritually advanced, mentally advanced, have psychic ability. You know, in many ways, I've pointed out that the disclosure around our ancient past in Atlantis is actually a much bigger disclosure than UFO disclosure, because UFO disclosure tells you there appears out there in the universe that are alien in origin. But this tells us our own story, which has to be somehow even more powerful information when you think about it. Yes.
Last question. William Ledger. Is the Epic of Gilgamesh directly related to the Atlantean story?
Yeah, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the original Noah story. It comes out of the Sumerian texts. And Gilgamesh does remarkable things. And he looks down at the earth from a great height as well. But the Noah story is interesting. Cayce places the Noah story, says it's a real story, but he places it in the second destruction of Atlantis around 22,000 BC. And in that 22,000 BC period, you have a tremendous shifting of the poles and the second great destruction in Atlantis. And there's three great destructions. The third one brings them down, and that's the crystal. In the first and the third destruction, the crystal is set too high, and it causes incredible apotheum effects that take down the entire continent. The first time that it happens, the effects are set on the two-eye stone too high, and it splits the island into three islands. And the islands are Poseidia, Arion, and Og. And Poseidia is that large island that constituted Cuba, Bimini, everything that's in the hot zone that's underwater. That whole is all that remains. Above ground is Andros, Bimini, and Cuba and the Bahamas. Everything else has sunk since, but that was the principal center for Atlantis in that spot. Yeah, that's all three?
That's all three.
Excellent.
Although I have a great one for later.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, Karen Carpenter wants to know, is the metaverse the eighth sphere or just a component of it? We were just talking about this.
Oh my God. Look, that thing is point for point the eighth sphere. I mean, they're just creating it outright. And, they're creating false things that you can buy, false real estate that you'll buy in the metaverse. And they're getting all these people sort of sucked in on this, set up your own phony personality and all that stuff. And it's investing in a false world. It's just a thought projection. And we're going to get into thought projections tonight because that's the root, in fact, of the Atlantis story. But I think that whole virtual reality thing that Steiner was outlining as the eighth sphere, and the attempt there is to kind of get these souls on a track and take them off their spiritual evolutionary track and put them into this artificial harmonic eighth sphere track. That is what things like the metaverse, this is where they're going. They're going to start having you feed into this false reality with your consciousness. And you're literally going to project your consciousness outside of your physical body to the point where you'll have more of a life there. And we've seen this with some people with their phones, but they're enjoying more of a life there on the phone than in their regular life. I mean, that is a real schizophrenic situation. And, the people behind it, just think of somebody like Zuckerberg. I mean, these are not, unfortunately, we don't have the leaders in our culture that we need or that we deserve. And we're the only ones who can change that. But right now, we seem to have some of the worst. In fact, I can't think of anyone who's in power that I think is a sort of a righteous leader right now. So I think we're in very deep trouble. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series 121. We're going deep now, Atlantean DNA. And we're going to get to some very interesting things through the figure of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, who gave readings over 4 decades, principally medical readings, trying to help people with physical problems. But they expanded into life readings. And sure enough, he got himself into a whole lot of trouble, got thrown out of the Sunday schools that he was teaching because they heard, hey, this guy is talking about past lives in Atlantis and Egypt, and saying that, ancient man walked around with advanced technology and flew in ships. Like, get this guy out. And so there was a real personal cost, I think, for him. And we can take so much, I think, from his work that he stuck with it, but I don't think it was easy. And it was a very different type of situation for a psychic in that period than it was, say, now. But you find a real interesting kind of fingerprint of the mystery schools is bringing forward information that relates to the psychic realm, mediumship, the afterlife, all these types of psychic development pieces come directly from the mystery school advancing. And they had been heavily suppressed by the church before that, to the point where if somebody came out with that information, as we know, in the 15th or 16th century, you could be burned at the stake. So it's a very kind of tricky scenario. When it actually starts to come up, we take it for granted that people can talk freely about psychic experience and all these types of things. For a long time, that was completely suppressed and underground. By the time the mystery schools bring it forward, the culture does weird things with it. There's the spiritualism craze in the 1860s. And it's a huge misfire, because the mystery schools are trying to get people to understand the spiritual side of life and how it integrates with this rising science. As a matter of fact, Rudolf Steiner calls his work spiritual science for that very reason. But what happens is people get obsessed with this idea of the summerland or the afterlife, and it becomes a real craze to communicate with their relatives in the afterlife. And they started to assume, hey, you know what's happening? Actually, our lives are exactly the same on the other side. And so that was not the message that the mystery schools were trying to bring forward. The mystery schools were trying to give us a sense that there was much more, and that all we had to do was raise our own consciousness around this. And through figures like Rudolf Steiner and Blavatsky and Cayce, we started to get some of this. And I think by the 60s, that's when it was really spreading widely. People were into dreams, psychic experience. The 70s loaded with that. And by the 90s, the New Age really has taken it all over. And I think that there's a lot of promise involved. There's too much commercialism, and there's too simple a spirituality. But by the 90s, I think we're at a place where it's starting to really seep into the culture. And then 9/11 happens, and we go into kind of a dark decade there, a dark doorway. And I think the idea was, if we can get these people to just be terrified, we can control them through fear. And they've been doing a good job ever since, right? We've been deeply involved with it. All right, back to Cayce. I'm going to go through a couple of pertinent readings, and I'm going to just jump and grab different sections. We're going to see how this all threads together. Before this, we find the entity was in the Atlantean land, when there were the periods of the law of children of one, the Amilius group, and the sons of Belial. The entity, with its abilities to bring those things to pass from the application of spiritual laws in its use for gratifying of material appetites, brought under its control many of those brought into the material experience of the opposite sex, or was able to make them, one form or another, shapely, unshapely, and those forms divine, those also who were monstrosities, in each as to become to the self disturbing at times, but to self that it had need of. This brought to self disaster, in that there were appetites which must be curbed. So this was the after effect. He came back in his life with all these appetites. Interestingly enough, though, what he's saying here is that this was an Atlantean scientist who, with the sons of Belial, had learned how to project these clones in. And what they were doing was making the, basically the equivalent of sex robots. And he's saying they were brought into material experience of the opposite sex, and was able to make them, one form or another, shapely or unshapely, with those forms divine, those with such monstrosities in each as to become to the self-disturbing at times. In other words, these experiments backfired and they created these Frankensteins at times as well. Here we have again that hint in the Cayce readings that the Atlantean scientists and the Belial group are using this, basic cloning laboratory, this cloning idea, and creating their own versions. And that's where the whole things, automatons piece comes from. Another reading here. Those individuals who'd come through these sojourns in the earth as souls, pushed into matter as to become separate entities, without the consideration of principle, the ability of self-control. The things might be compared to the domestic pets of today, to the present development of the horse, the mule, the dog, the cat. This is not intended to indicate that there is transmigration or transmutation of the soul from animal to human. Cayce didn't believe in that. But the comparison is made as to trait, as to mind, as to how those domesticated in the present are dependent upon their masters for that consideration of their material as well as their mental welfare. These beings that the Atlanteans are causing to come in are basically pets and servants and playthings for them. Yet in each, there is still the instinct, the predominant nature, or that class of group soul impregnation into which it has pushed itself for self-expression, being influenced by the groups or individuals about same. There were those disputations with them as to the purposes of the children of Belial, that these were to be exploited rather than to be made equals, and thus endowed with spiritual understanding. So they're projecting beings into existence for their own amusement, as a labor force, as an army, whatever it might be, but they can't be equal with them. So basically, the things are being developed as a lower level of humanity. And the Belial group is doing this. They're using the same technique that the Amelius group was using, but for a totally different purpose. Because the Amelius group was also projecting out these different beings, and those were meant to be a kind of a lineage, like a holy sacred lineage. These guys are just creating, all these different types of things for their own enjoyment, and occasionally creating monstrosities. This is extraordinary, edgy stuff for the 1920s with Cayce's work, yes.
John Maxuda just mentioned Blade Runner.
Yes, I was thinking of Blade Runner with this. And it's true, I think one of the great things about Blade Runner, which comes from a Philip K. Dick novel, is it captures that idea of what is the tricky ground that we're on in relation to cloning? Because if you develop a clone, can you imbue the clone with a soul? It's not coming in through the normal channels. What if you just engineer something in a test tube, a la Brave New World? What are the differences spiritually there? There are dramatic differences, apparently.
Can I cut to the chase?
Sure.
Okay, this is for me. So it seems that everyone, we talk about this a lot, that everyone here, what would be the best way to spend our life here on Earth? It seems like everybody keeps falling into wanting to play God here and reincarnate here and sort of perfect human life here. But isn't certainly the Eastern thought is to get the hell out of here, as to break the cycle of samsara, right? And evolve out of the earth plane, out of the
overcome.
Need. Yeah. So
we should overcome.
So, but yet what we do is we try to master the earth plane, be masters of the universe, right? What does Cayce say about all this? Isn't the point to graduate?
There are a number of people who come to Cayce and get readings, and he says, you've actually suffered so much that you're beyond the point of facilitating or needing a reincarnation on Earth. So there's no question that every person enters with a mission to do with development in mind, and it's sort of like a prearranged thing that their soul has. And I think that a great deal of that is being interfered with in the current era. You can imagine the souls that lived through World War II and the things that they came in and chose to experience. And you could say that some of that is karma or whatever, but it's an incredible derailing of people's intentions, just like the wars they're trying to drag us into now take us so far away from the type of spiritual potentialities that we can produce within ourselves. And there's no question the heart of it in the Cayce work and in Steiner's work relates back to soul memory. And this is something which you can tap into. It's part of the process of learning about ourselves spiritually. And I think what the Cayce work is saying in particular is people are constantly meeting themselves. So, if you had a life where you abused things on a particular line, like this person making these clones for his own entertainment and stuff, he reincarnates and he doesn't have any willpower in this life. And the lack of willpower is giving him tremendous problems. So, there's tremendous, I remember there's one book called Scars of the Soul, which was just a compilation of all these different people and the different health issues that they had, going to Cayce and finding out that in some life they had done something that many of those health issues were directly related to something that they had done in a previous life. Brings up a whole different area. People always want to learn, what do I have on a hereditary basis about, a disposition for a certain type of illness? Well, forget about that. What do you have in a karmic line? I mean, it's interesting. Just because you don't know about it doesn't mean it's not effective in your life. This is the tricky part.
Actually, I just wanted to mention, and one of my hobbies is watching near-death experiencers on
hobbies.
YouTube.
That's an obsession for you.
It is kind of an obsession. And one of these women was talking about how you can, if you are a fairly advanced soul, you can actually come into a family taking it upon yourself the work of actually cleansing the karma for the group, because they are so enmeshed, and the karma
that
is
sounds
so dense.
tough. I mean, it's tough enough to do it for yourself.
Well, therapists, I want to say therapists always talk about, there's usually one member of a family who's called the I'm forgetting what it's called.
Yes, I know what you're talking about.
It's something like the identified patient,
the
or something
martyr?
like that. And it basically, it's the one who does the work for the collective, for the group.
Yes.
And I never thought of it in terms of clearing the karma for the group, but I can say personally that when I have broken through and cleared some of my own things, that I did see it ripple throughout my family in ways that were unexpected.
Interesting. Aha.
Mm-hmm.
The group dynamic is active at all times. You can see that. You can see it with friends also. Yeah.
Catherine Harris calls it the family hero. I agree. And the black sheep. Yep.
She knows from where she speaks. This is interesting. And you have to think about these things in terms of, how they ripple out in a real time experience. I always think about Cayce's life, and, he had tremendous financial problems. And he goes at a certain point and says, why, when I'm trying to do all this kind of spiritual work, am I faced over and over again with these impossible financial conditions? And the readings instruct him that it was due to his life as a soldier named John Bainbridge just before he entered as Cayce. And as Bainbridge, he had the same psychic ability, but he used it for being great at gambling. So when he was playing cards or playing poker or something, he would know what was going on, and he funded his entire kind of, savoir-faire lifestyle doing this, incredible psychic gambling. And as a result of that, when he reincarnated, he had to almost face over and over again these impossible financial conditions because of that. Quite interesting.
It's amazing they haven't made a movie out of that.
I know. Well, here's a really weird thing for those who are into the eternal recurrence type idea, which is, you go through one life, and then at the end of this life, when you die, you start your life all over again. The same exact stuff happens. It's like Groundhog Day. But Cayce talks about Bainbridge incarnating basically around Virginia and Ohio and all these different places. And he's a soldier and all the rest of it. But he talks about him around the 1800s doing this. Then he talks about him in the 1700s, same guy, same life, the same deal, but it's 100 years earlier. So he lived two lives as Bainbridge, 100 years apart. Same name, same locality, same job, same profession. Probably same lessons too. But something about that Bainbridge life, we'll get into that at some point, because I've always found it incredibly fascinating. Like everything else around Cayce. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew! The things. Yes, the automatons, the Atlantean clones, the Atlantean DNA that the elite groups are looking for. What is this all about? And what are the mystery schools? What were they doing, leaving that all out there for us? And were we able to pick up the threads that they left there for us? Who's picked them up? The work of Theosophy and Steiner and Gurdjieff and Cayce. Have we really brought that information out the way that we should have, the way it was left? Well, we're giving it a try here in the ideas room for sure. We're going to be taking your questions, more questions in the second part of the show. And I'm going to get into an interesting area now. I want to remind you, before we go there, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter that keeps us in touch through hell or high water, through wars and rumors of wars. But that's really important, I think, just to keep us with our own pipeline back and forth. And it's a free newsletter. It comes to you once a week. Nothing heavy or marketing heavy in there, just a layout of some incredible shows we have coming up for you, some surprises, and some remarkable interviews that are going to blow your mind here coming into the spring that you will not believe. Just you wait. And remember, I have to mention this too, which is 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to have the 4th anniversary show. It's a 2-parter, and we're going to have great guests, and it's a no holds barred X series. It's going to be X series 122, part 1 and 2 on March 18th and 19th. So mark it on your calendar now. It's not next week. It's the week after. Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds good.
And a big surprise.
Big surprise. Okay. Let's see. Now, I wanted to get into a couple of things about Adam, because we talked about the pre-adamite stuff. I want to bring a little bit of the Adam piece in here so we can understand the DNA part. So they ask him, explain the information given regarding Amelius, who first noted the separation of the people into male and female, as it relates to the story of the Bible and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, giving the symbols Adam and Eve, the apple and the serpent. Cayce answers, this Amelius, Adam, as given, first discerned from himself, not the beasts about him, was drawn, that which made for the propagation of beings in the flesh, that made for that companionship as seen by creation in the material worlds about same. The story, the tale of Adam and Eve is one and the same. The apple is the apple of the eye. The desire of that companionship innate in that created is innate in the creator and brought companionship into creation itself. This is actually very deep. The next question is about Lilith. How is the legend of Lilith connected to the period of Amelius? Now, Lilith is out there, again, like Amelius. It's another Eve, and there have been so many stories about her. She's sort of an early version of Eve. And there are so many legends, very positive generally, about her. So Cayce says, in the beginning, as was outlined, they were presented that which became the sons of God, in that male and female were in one. So we're talking about androg beings. This is so interesting when we see all this push for trans this and trans that. And, I'm not talking about individual people who are trans and going through these things. I'm talking about that push from the scientific level to make everybody, boom, genderless and all this kind of stuff. They are hearkening back to an occult version of this androgyny. And when we look at the occult purposes behind that, we can really look at this story in an interesting fashion, because Amelius is doing it and he's separating out for the advancement of the souls. He's saying we're going to separate male and female, and these are going to be separate beings and complement each other. And the way that it was set up at the time is the single androgen. It was basically a period where they needed to move beyond that. What the kind of higher scientific people are trying to do now, the singularity people, with the genderless merging of those genders, is actually an occult inversion of the same process that Amelius laid out 100,000 years ago. Okay. In that male and female were in one with those abilities for those changes as were able to be capable of being brought about, in the changes that came from those things as were the projections of the abilities of those entities to project. This as a being came through as a companion when there were the turning from the within to the sources of creation, as to make for the help meet, or that is created by the first cause and the creative forces. That brought into being that as was made then from out of self, not just a companion of the body. Hence the legend of the association of the body during the period before there was brought into being the last of the creations, which was not that as was not made, but the first of that that was made. So I'm going to try to explain some of this. So what's remarkable about what he's saying here is that Amelius is taking a completely different track from what was happening with the kind of Belial groups. What the Belial people were doing as thought projections becoming physical, they were becoming overwhelmed. As spiritual beings, they were becoming overwhelmed by physical sensations. And as a result, they were getting locked deeper and deeper into the earth, and they were getting basically encased in it. What happened with Amelius is his projection is he's projecting out from himself. He's splitting himself into male and female. And so they're both higher creations. They have the ability to create a totally different lineage than what's happening with the Belial group. And that's exactly what they do. And what he's saying is this is coming from, instead of projecting in and being trapped by a system, they're coming in and choosing to create a higher spiritual balanced group. And this is why Amelius is Adam. And what happens is that the idea of Adam as happening in 5 places at once is the understanding that Adam is not an individual. He is a happening in human experience. And the whole Adam and Eve story are a projection of these beings, this different level of beings that were coming in at that crucial aspect in humanity's development. But they talk all about the pre-adamite period, and it seems like it's sort of anybody's game going on in the pre-adamite period. If you look into the Book of Enoch and the things that are talked about there in relation to the Watchers and so on, you know, so much of that story about Nephilim and different types of groups, even the Anunnaki group, pretty much abused themes to take in this alien idea that a bunch of aliens came down here and did DNA tests and stuff. That's fine, but let's look at it a different way, which is basically you had such advanced people in Atlantis that scientifically they were outdoing each other. And that this group, Amelius, comes in to set up a track for souls to incarnate into that isn't mired in this incredible investment. And so this idea of the fall and so on comes along with that as well. Now there's a piece of the Steiner work which plays very deeply into this, but I think it's important for us to go to this end of the esoteric level, to this end of the desoteric pool, to get a deeper understanding of what Cayce's giving us here and how the things keep coming up. And the things seem to be this weird projection where the Belial group tries over and over again to get their perfect version going, and all the things that they're creating they have a physical beauty to them, but the essence of them, again, they're using them as slaves for pleasure, whatever it happens to be. And I think we're dangerously close to this with the whole cloning concept, sex robots. This type of thing is the place where the things come into play. And this is that crucial stop where the Atlantean DNA becomes an important switch, because there's the Amelius part and there's the Belial part, and where do each of them go? We know the Belial group blows up Atlantis at the end and takes it down, And they overcome the Amilius group, but the Amilius group flees to the three different centers of the earth, Egypt, the Maya, and the Inca land. So we have there a picture of two different groups. And again, as we're looking now here in the 21st century, we seem to be operating side by side with a group that wants nothing to do with the higher ideals of the other group. And it's the group that holds power and holds incredible scientific mind control powers to its advantage, as well as incredible physical might. So it seems like the Amelius-Belial war continues on. And again, Belial being Baal, that's the Ahrimanic force that Steiner identifies using the Persian designation. So that's the being that we're talking about here. And it is that setup. And when we get into Steiner's work, he's talking about the 21st century being kind of that battleground technologically for Ahriman to incarnate into. That's the nature of the situation we find ourselves in. A quote from Steiner's Cosmic Memory book gives us some of this piece. Now he's talking about someone named Manu, who comes after. He's in that Amelius line, but he comes after. And as Atlantis is starting to break up, he's saying, I'm going to take the best of the best spiritually and take them somewhere else and save them. So this is a little something about this leader. Think of how high this person is regarded when Steiner looks at this. The principal leader, Manu, was assisted by other divine messengers who executed his intention for particular branches of life and worked on the development of the new race. For it was a matter of arranging all of life according to a new conception of a divine administration of the world. Everywhere the thoughts of men were to be directed from the visible to the invisible. Life is determined by the forces of nature. The course of human life depends on day and night, winter, summer, sunshine, and rain. How these individual visible events are connected with the invisible divine powers and how man was to behave in order to arrange his life in accordance with these invisible powers was shown to him. All knowledge and all labor was to be pursued in this sense. In the course of the stars and the weather, man was to see divine decrees and the emanation of divine wisdom. Astronomy, meteorology were taught with this idea. Man was to arrange his labor, his moral life in such a way that they would correspond with the wise laws of the divine. Life was ordered according to these divine commandments, just as the divine thoughts were explored in the course of the stars and the changes of the weather. Man was to bring his works into harmony with the dispensation of the gods through these acts. It was the intention of Manu to direct everything in human life towards higher worlds. All human activities, all institutions were to bear a spiritual character. This is crucial. So again, like Amelius, Manu is showing up during the destruction of Atlantis, and he eventually will take a group to Ireland first, collect the best of the best, of about 100, and then take them all to India. And on the other side of the Atlantic, we have Iltar, who is in Poseidia, which is the area of the hot zone where the Bahamas is. That area is sinking, and he takes his following with the same type of thing, and he creates a new Atlantis in Yucatan, and he puts the third Hall of Records there. These groups and the message that they're giving, can you imagine if we were being compelled to associate the things that we're doing in terms of a divine order and things of this line? So we can see back there's a tremendous struggle where the Belial group gets the upper hand and destroys Atlantis, but there are these groups and these kind of shipwrecked travelers who have strayed from that tremendous battle and the upheavals and all the rest. And on the physical front of it, you might say, well, the Belial group won, but they blew everything up. In fact, they, through this process, the groups that are spun out create incredibly high civilization and spirituality in ancient Egypt, the original Mayan culture, and the original Incan culture. All these will disintegrate over time. But it is quite fascinating to look at the snapshot of how it happened before the things that we know about, because all of these tremendous researchers have been telling us for years, and it's almost absurd for us to be at this point and not to have actually officially changed history on any of these things, even with the proof and carbon dating and everything else in. There's a much older story to humanity's origins. This is where they're leading us, they're telling us. But part of that war involved a scientific battle about beings that were being created to be slaves. And those slaves, there's an echo in the way that they were created that comes from the Belial group. The thing that they were after were the way that the Amelius group projected these perfected beings. The Atlantis cult that we see that has arisen in the 20th century and the 21st century, and it operates behind the scenes, as we've shown in the Hot Zone episodes dealing with Epstein and the MIT professors and so on, is something where in the background, just like the CIA's search and through the ARE and the planting of individual agents at the ARE to get to what was going on there in relation to the Hall of Records, those are actually records that the CIA released, and they placed agents at the ARE in 1964. They were looking for this information. So then next we have to ask ourselves why they were doing this. And I want to kind of jump in and start to say that the group that is being created now, the kind of cyborg clone types, they're trying to attempt the same thing that they did with the things in Cayce's story. Now, whether or not you believe in Cayce's vision of an all-powerful Atlantis with spacecraft and advanced technology and the two-eye stone running everything, and incredible spiritual communication with the saintly realm, we have to say that he was very far advanced with his projection of the story of Atlantis, considering what we're faced against now. In this story, which comes out of Wired, they're talking about the future of robotics, and it says, the headline is, will robots take over the world? Robots are already around us, whether it's the automated machines that assemble our vehicles, virtual assistants that use our conversational interfaces to help us around the house. Yet, as we've seen, they're not currently suitable for all areas of life, but that will change in the future. Despite fears of an AI takeover, the dominant intelligence on the planet is likely to be humans. Such a scenario, however, Business Network's PwC predicts that 30% of jobs could be automated by robots by 2030. Think about that. 30% of everything run by robots. Other reports suggest that the stock of robots worldwide could reach 20 million by 2030. And with automated workers taking up to 51 million jobs in the next 10 years. So while they may not take over the world, we can expect to see many more robots in our daily lives. Well, the robots don't need to take over the world if the Belial group has control of them. But you can see from that, Belial's back, baby. I mean, and back with more tech than ever before. The things that Cayce was laying out in these visions, and these aren't, I cannot stress enough how in-depth Cayce's Atlantis story is. There's 900 different life readings, and over 700 of those readings mention Atlantis. It's an incredible legacy.
Wow.
Yeah. And when you think about it, there was nothing really like it. I mean, there was mention in Anthroposophy and Theosophy of Atlantis, and Ignatius Donnelly's book, as I mentioned. But this level of scientific advancement, yes. Theosophy talks about them having flying ships. So does Anthroposophy. But nowhere is there the detail that Cayce attains with this. And part of it, I'm thinking, is that he was able to access his own experiences as Rata, going back and forth, spending all the time at the height of its culture before it sank. Famously, Cayce predicted that the Hall of Records beneath the Sphinx would be opened with the entire records of the history of Atlantis and the construction of the two-eye stone. there's been an incredible, almost political intrigue around that. And people like Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner, who were connected with the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the Cayce Foundation initially, but then disparaged Cayce publicly and his ideas, probably more than anyone in the scientific community. There's a weird thing there where they want to work on that stuff in the background and do it and keep the results for themselves or the groups that they work with. At a certain point, Hawass was made a cabinet member of the Mubarak government, which is one of the most corrupt governments, and he wound up going to jail, of course. So these are the types of people who've been around this story. And whenever I hear about Mark Lehner and the things that he says, oh, Cayce's story can never be true. And this was somebody who was in charge of the Giza Plateau. If you go back into Mark Lehner's history, he dated Hewlin Cayce's daughter. And Hewlin Cayce sent him through college and wanted to have their guy in Cairo who could help them facilitate these searches for the Hall of Records and things like that. So these people really have kind of taken the Cayce support and the Cayce ideas and run roughshod over the original intention. One thing I have, and I think it's a hard book to get, it's a book that Lehner wrote before he became corrupted by that system. It's 1974. He's a young guy. I think he's in his early 20s, and it contains some of the edgiest Cayce readings. This is the same guy who now debunks Cayce and pals around with Hawass, saying, oh, this stuff never happened. One of the other things I want to point out, and what we might see as part of this electric phase that we're in with all this, is the discovery of new Edgar Cayce readings bring total documented to 14,307. In fact, there's an additional 7,000 readings floating around out there from when Cayce did not have a stenographer, including Nikola Tesla's reading. And we know that the readings that Cayce did on Bimini for a business group were stolen. So that's very important because of the Poseidon temple rising and the land rising factor involved. These things are incredible. The more you get into them, the more that you see the full picture. There's something dramatic happening there in the hot zone. And we're all starting to become aware of it now. And I'm trying to make sure that everyone is aware of what's happening there. Yes.
I believe you just alluded to this, but Christopher Bishop wanted to know why were only 14,000 of 20,000 of Mr. Cayce's readings recorded?
Well, there's so many travels that Cayce made. He went all across America, and he'd get called for different readings all the time. And some of them would have to do in Texas with oil. Some of them were in Ohio, some in California, and some in Arizona. So when he had Gladys Davis with him, or his wife, Gladys Davis became full-time with them in about 1923. Before that, his wife would do it, but Cayce would get so many requests before it was like a steady thing, because again, his psychic work was something that almost intruded on his regular life because he was a photographer, and he had a studio there in Kentucky originally, and then in Alabama. And so we have to look at him and say that over and over again, life pushed him into this. And eventually he would wind up doing remarkable things like, giving psychic readings for the president, Woodrow Wilson, in 1919, 1920, and originally for his health, because Wilson was in terrible health. And there was a cousin of Wilson's who lived in Virginia Beach and heard these remarkable things about Cayce and what he could do. And then also Cayce was to give readings for Henry Wallace, who was vice president under FDR. Very high-level people. Thomas Edison's reading is another one that is not on the record. Edison and Tesla are people that both met Cayce and both took readings, along with Harry Houdini and others. So it's an incredible background and the incredible impact of those readings. I will still say that for all their impact, the Atlantis side is so remarkable, and it's so edgy, and it is so incredibly loaded with potential for study, that I think the projection of Cayce very often is, well, he wanted to do all these nice things, and he was a Sunday school teacher, is great, because it's true. But it doesn't get to what the readings are a very exciting, potent flow of information from the mystery schools direct into the population through this incredible psychic mystic. And we can't lose sight of the kind of import of that Atlantis material, because it's overshadowed by the kind of like, hey, Cayce predicted disaster in 2025 or something. We see so much of that. And there's a thing rolling around now that says Cayce predicts that, Ivan Putin or, that Putin is going to save humanity or something.
There are a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, it's not true. This is very important because Russia figures so prominently in Cayce's future projections that he says through Russia will come the hope of the world. And he specifically says through its spiritual thought. He also says that Russian has this incredible, resources and friendship with America in the future, and that both nations can benefit from dramatically and kind of lead the world forward. So he's looking at a potential future and really seeing great things happening. And he refers to Russia as the hope of the world on numerous occasions. So there's something very important there brewing as a spiritual group. Putin and the actions in the Ukraine and things like that just don't have anything to do with it. And, that type of aggression action is the kind of thing that we did in Iraq, and it doesn't work out, doesn't come out right. There's no way to make a situation like that come out right when you're taking those types of steps. So the political situation in Russia, Ukraine, all that is very tricky from the standpoint of the United States. But that system that's moving in to, it's funny, they go to freeze Russia's assets and freeze this and freeze that. What does that remind you of? It reminds me of Canada freezing the truckers. See, that system is not the right system either. And this is the problem when we look at it. We need something completely new, a totally new track. But we can't ascribe, I don't think, to people like Putin. What it is these leaders have a great opportunity. And, I think that in truth, Trump and Putin had the potential to have a partnership that would lead America, but there was an incredible fear campaign that was pumped up by these neocons, and the neocons have all become heavily Democratic of late, although there's still a good deal of them in the Republican Party as well. And they want war because war is incredible money. And the defense contractors will make incredible money. And regardless of how they have people walking around and saying, the Ukrainians are heroes and all this, the people in Ukraine and the people in Russia, like there's an incredible potential there. And all we can hope for is for a cessation of hostilities. And America should be behind that effort. We shouldn't be encouraging it. And we shouldn't have encouraged, that great breach of maybe they'll get into NATO and all that stuff. And I don't think that anyone could support Putin's actions in response because the people on the ground suffer. So those aren't the right things. What we can hope for is that both sides back off. It's possible. And that's where I think the hope lies. Okay. But yeah, let's do something in relation to the Cayce readings. Here's something you see. If somebody puts up a Cayce quote, always ask, what's the reading number? For example, and looking at this reading, they always list them this way. The one that I mentioned about Amelius and Adam, it's 364-5. The readings are all numbered. So if somebody throws up a quote like that, we have to know where it's coming from. JFK made tremendous quotes in his life, but I sometimes see weird quotes with his face that have nothing to do, and I know his work really quite well. So we have to be aware of that. And also remember, the more due diligence we do on our side, the less we can be sucker punched by the mainstream media who says, oh, guess what the internet believed today? They're probably the ones putting the stuff out. Yes.
It's very uncomfortable to admit that we don't know, that we're very limited in our information.
Yeah, we know for sure in relation to Ukraine, there's something wrong with the story we're being given about what's happening over there. they're trying to draw us in deeper than it already is. And just like they were trying to set the story out there that the nuclear thing was, on fire and all this, it turns out that the nuclear plant is in Russian hands. It's not on fire. And so we have to be wary that forces in the war parties, I don't care if it's Republican, Democrat, Russian, or whoever, trying to draw us in deeper to war. Very simple. Whoever wants to drive you in deeper to war, hold off. And I've said this, there's a lot of simple rules I think we can adopt for things. In the UFO threat field part, get the CIA out of it. If you're not listening to the CIA, you'll probably get closer to the truth. So, this is very important stuff, I think, for us to really assimilate on a deep level. And that's something that we're doing here. Okay. You got more?
Along those lines, I really love the way this is worded from Standard to God. DJ, do you see Putin as genuinely anti-globalist / NWO, or do you see him as simply playing a role within their agenda?
Well, it's tricky. It's very tricky. There's no question that he was an elite that didn't sign on with the larger elite picture, which is why they had problems with him. For example, he didn't want to encourage GMOs on his population. There's so many things that are wrong with that globalist structure that it's easy to criticize them and then make Putin look good. At the same time, Putin got drawn into this situation, and he is the one who's, attacking Ukraine. So there's no right on either side of that. But I will say this, that the goal of the globalists and the Davos crowd has been to draw Russia into a situation like this. And I think instead of choosing and embracing a peaceful global solution, those people want war, and they want war with us too. Remember, their main target are the citizens, and the state leaders are also secondary. But I would say that there was a destiny for Putin that he could choose, and he could turn things around dramatically. But I think it's obvious that even for people who might have had some sense that, we were the ones who were aggressing by threatening to put NATO on his doorstep, now he looks just as much like an aggressor. So the only way out of it is for everybody to back off. And that's the kind of diplomacy that you had during the Cuban Missile Crisis with JFK. And it's totally missing now. And we hear, all these people are supposed to be liberals and stuff on TV saying we need to bomb, into Russia and create no-fly zones and all this nonsense. No, we don't need to do any of that. We need to bring the whole thing to a halt by negotiating some kind of a settlement.
I think there's one thing we can agree on, which is all of us just feel like we are beyond war at this point.
Yes.
It's like the people are going, this is barbaric. It
really
is primitive. And I have zero interest in any of this. And that if this is where our leaders lead us, this is no confidence in them whatsoever.
Yeah.
I really, remove them all. They're not doing anybody any favors.
We have a terrible gap in leadership. I'm amazed because I feel like people's consciousness on the ground is lifting up.
Yes.
And then we have this tremendous come down.
Actually, I think this is the actual secret. They have. I think that the unwashed masses have gotten a bad rap throughout history. I think maybe it's possible that we were always more evolved than the elites who were fighting with each other. You know?
Well,
we're not interested in any of this.
Well, let's think about it. Not to be judge and jury and whatever, but just based on their actions, right? Look at the tech leaders. Mark Zuckerberg, right? No respect for privacy, caught in dozens of schemes for manipulating people's data, manipulating elections and all the rest. Our friend Jack, who stepped down from Twitter, and all the weirdness that he pulled, banning the president of the United States from, come on. Real just psychotic leadership. Bill Gates. These are not evolved people, and the problem is, people have said, well, America hasn't proved to be very evolved. So, civilization, we're going to see like China rise, whatever. China throws people in jail for the wrong tweet, right? I mean, they're not evolved. Chinese people are very evolved. The leadership of the CCP is not. They're incredible, brutal dictatorship, and they're like a prophet dictatorship. So it's not even like they have real good ideology. And so, these are not the evolved groups that we need. And I think with group like Putin, he's showing that he's somebody who could be manipulated into taking action against, aggressing a neighbor country, a smaller neighbor country, right? So this is where we're seeing so much of this work. And the people that are supposed to be stepping up, like looking around for like Churchill or FDR or any of these people, and you've got Kamala Harris and step for Biden. I mean, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. And I'm hoping there's a way out of it through the voices and the exchange of ideas in places like here in the Ideas Room. But yeah, thanks for the political question. I think something we can't avoid at this time in talking about that war. I do want to say, though, the challenge, remember that Cayce went through World War I and World War II. Remember the Gurdjieff work went through the Russian Revolution. Remember that Steiner went through World War I with anthroposophy, and that the Theosophical Society went through that as well. These groups and the spiritual intent of the groups and the impact of the ideas last beyond any particular crisis. And I think I want to say this in relation to the Ukraine. In fact, the real crisis that's upon us is the digital ID system takeover coming out of the global elite through the Davos crowd. And that's going to automate every person and make you a slave and make any dissent impossible. That's a much bigger threat than any war going on in the Ukraine. So the way that I would look at it is that's where we need to stay fixed. And just remember a few months ago, the same things that they were doing to Putin, shutting off, his funds and everything like that, they were doing to truck drivers. That's where the mentality is. Chrystia Freeland, who used to cozy up to Russian oligarchs. These are the people. And so we have to be very aware of that. But look, Cayce had his villains too. He lived through the era of Hitler and Stalin, so these are things that we can use, these tools that are available for us. And for sure, the types of conversations that we have here in the Ideas Room and bringing these things out are exactly the kinds of things that they want to censor and suppress in the future. I have no doubt about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 121, leading up to the 4-year anniversary of the X Series coming up on March 18th, which will be episode 122. And this is Atlantean DNA, Cayce and his visions of the things, the automatons, and what the Belial group had brought forward. We're going to be taking your questions here now. Actually, we're going to take them right now. I want to remind you before we do that, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our free newsletter. We're going to be listing a lot of exciting things in there coming up. Great guests, amazing X shows coming up, and documentaries, and even some events. You're going to want to be on that list and make sure you stand up and be counted. If you want to support the show, of course, you can do that also at the website, and we appreciate you guys being subscribers, and we'll try to figure out how to make it just so worthwhile for you. And we've kept it something where anybody can join because it's so inexpensive. It's so inexpensive. What is it, $5 a month? I mean, it's about as inexpensive as you can get. And, we appreciate all the support that we get. Okay, a couple of quick things, and then we'll go right to your questions. All right, Belial, the after effect of Belial moves to Mexico, and the what degrades the Mayan culture, the advent of the Aztec culture, and they start to go into a death worship. And what's interesting is there are competing mentalities around this period. Quetzalcoatl is a bearded figure who lands on the shores of the Mayan culture and gives them a totally different mentality. and gives them an understanding of mathematics and science and all these incredible things. And he's a bearded figure, and in that part of the world, there aren't bearded figures. So this individual is an initiate coming out of perhaps the lost Atlantis culture. He's bringing them a new culture. He also comes in and he looks substantially different. He's Caucasian, and he is giving them a totally different dispensation. For some reason, he's accepted. And they have an incredible time with him. What happens is, and this gets into the thing part again, I want us to think a little bit about this idea of the things, because part of it was suggested that they were merging animal material with human material to create different types of beings. That figure, Quetzalcoatl, will morph into Kukulkan. And Kukulkan is a feathered serpent who was, again, giving that very advanced Quetzalcoatl message: astronomy, mathematics, science, etc. But it seems to lean in on the wisdom side, and they seem to use that wisdom teaching in a perverted fashion, and that's where you get sacrifice in those cultures. But the idea of the serpent of wisdom and all the rest of it was quite different. The figures of Horus and Anubis in Egyptian mythology, we have this mix of the jackal. In the Sphinx, we have, of course, the man on the lion's body. There's something significant here. This is the echo of what they were trying to do and how it was reversed so that we could use these things in a positive fashion. And somehow the Sphinx becomes the ultimate mystery because it's a human who embodies the lion. So instead of the Belial group and the kind of twisted things that they were attempting to do by mixing different strands of DNA to create these kind of perfect beings, and in some cases creating Frankensteins, instead we find the symbology being combined there on the astral level. The power, just like in a Revelation, the bull and the eagle and all these things, the merging of those forces. And it's sort of getting through that terrible period when the Belial group projected themselves into the animal kingdom. So, it's using the same things in a totally different fashion. And I think that is where we can take it. And with that, Miss Olivia, I am to your questions.
Okay, get ready. There's tons of great questions. Okay,
Yes.
The dot connector.
All
What
right.
did Cayce say about World War III, if anything?
Well, one of the things that he said was that there would be a war over a one world digital, not digital, but a one world currency. And the thing that we see, of course, is the digital currency. And he didn't say that that would be a just thing or it was a good idea or a bad idea or whatever. He just said that's where you're probably going to get a war, is just through such conditions of a world currency. So there's a very tricky thing. There's a very tricky line here when we talk about things like the UN or the League of Nations and things of this nature. The United Nations idea, as laid out, was the result of being through all of these different wars. It was a good idea originally. What happened is when you get into the 60s, the Rockefellers invade the territory and they create the UN in a totally different fashion. As a matter of fact, they create their own group that mirrors the UN, but it's strictly for the Asian population. And what happens is we start to look at the influence of what happens with the UN, and it becomes the institution that we know now, which is just supports a world government. That's not what it's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be each country representing itself as a way to resolve things in a single body. And it made a lot of sense. Even in the periods after World War I, putting it together, the 14 points that were laid out originally by Wilson, those things made a lot of sense. What happens is that got voted down anyway, and it didn't get adopted, and we ended up in World War II. So, we're looking at a very tricky situation when we get into the idea of what the UN is. We should have some body that can help us to resolve different things and like kind of build a family of nations. Instead, it's run like a criminal organization. And so you have, again, the idea of a good idea gone bad. So over and over again, we have to bring the idealism of something like a United Nations, but make it fulfill its promise, just like the promise of America. What's the promise of America? Freedom of choice, freedom of speech, freedom to think. And what they want to do is say, oh, yeah, you're free as long as you don't think this, this, and this way. Because if you think this and this and this way, then you are, you know, a domestic terrorist or something, because you don't agree with Stepford Biden, and you know, you don't agree with the type of sort of liberal rules that we want. So you see how this is just fascism dressing up in different outfits. And we have to be very wary of that going into the future. Yes.
Roosevelt Media News, if we were given this gift of enlightenment, why are we darker than ever before? I don't think that's necessarily true, that we're darker than ever before.
Well, we're heading into very warlike circumstances. So I understand the thrust of what you're saying. It could be the darkest time if they are able to create a global control grid. And I don't want
to be around if they do that.
Well, this is the thing. It's through our actions that we will be around, and that won't come to pass. But I will say this, that the force, the strength, the power of a group being in opposition, a well-informed group. And I have to say what's going on, and I've had conversations about this, of course, it comes up in my interviews with Catherine Austin Fitts a lot, but it's mind control, and the way that the media works mind control to get you whipped up into a certain type of frenzy instead of being able to collect particular facts. They worked us to a frenzy over the COVID op. They're trying to work us into a frenzy over the Ukraine. They're trying to work us into a frenzy of the UFO threat, right? It's a threat. There's a threat out there. The CIA says there's a threat. We need a whole new office to track a threat. These are the tactics that they use. This is the new frontier, the battle that they're working on. And what they want to do is turn anyone who doesn't agree with them into a terrorist. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because at a certain point, you can't even tell if they're Republican or Democrat anymore. There's so much part of the war party there's almost no definition.
You know, a lot of people are falling for it, but
yeah.
I think what has happened, I know I'm repeating myself because I've talked about this in other shows, is that through books and in particular television and movies, they teach us about compassion and empathy because we live through the characters, right? We get to see their perspective from different races, different religions, different backgrounds, yes. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I actually think humanity was really growing, right? Because there's so much media. How many lives have I lived from watching television and watching movies?
Oh, yeah.
So many lifetimes.
Yeah.
I have so much perspective.
Yes.
You know, that my ancestors didn't have. So much more compassion and empathy. But now they're trying to rip it all away and say, no,
yes.
Hate, right? It's your 2 minutes hate thing.
Yes.
This group, that group, Russians, Putin, bad guy.
Well, they're so open about it. It's amazing. Like, you know, obviously the great thing that you could go back and look at these terrible thugs that were pushing around, you know, during the civil rights movement. There was all that going on, and you could go back earlier with fascism and Hitler and all the rest, and you see it throughout these different cultures. America used to stand so against it that America would be, even with all its problems, that you know, place where the type of discrimination wasn't tolerated. And, you know, we've been through things where there were tremendous splits in the culture, like the Vietnam War, for example. And we had some of the biggest protests ever in history, especially in Washington, D.C. And that was an incredible, you know, situation that was incredibly polarized. Richard Nixon was in office. People wanted out of the Vietnam War. And that's the way that it went. Nonetheless, Nixon got reelected with 60% of the vote or something like that. So, you know, we see that the power centers and the movers the way that it lines up in society over time. Here we are again, the whole thing is rolled back around, but now the protest is the object. If it's not a sanctioned protest by the establishment, which is absurd, because of course the only importance of a protest is to be able to challenge what? The establishment. Yes, I'm sorry, go for it.
Okay, so Wayne Peak wants to know, do you think this is at all related to the implementation of 5G?
Yes, I do. I think that the implementation of 5G represents all kinds of health things that have not been addressed, just like the injection does so many other things that they've pushed out. And they're not looking back because no one's holding them accountable. I think that 5G is unusual, and I don't think they've studied publicly just how potent the negative effects are. But I do feel that it's easier to control a population and keep them in a sense of entrainment. There's so many weird things I've been hearing about, and it goes back to a kind of a Havana syndrome type of attack system that we heard about when our diplomats went down to Cuba after they reopened relations before they got closed again. And the weird thing about those diplomats going down there is they would get these almost acoustic concussions. They couldn't do their work. They became sick and all the rest. They'd have to be shipped back to America. Here's the weird part. Even after they came back, they continued to experience the symptoms. Whoever is operating that kind of technology, it's not something that we in the public are aware of. And so it's very dangerous because you need to be able to counteract something like that. So we're in a period of time where the only thing that counts is transparency. And, like the good intentions matched with the transparency of what's really going on. What the media gives you is not transparency. It's cooked, and it's there to program you and train you to think a certain ways. And so many of us, we see them, jumping on board the crazy COVID train. I was listening to someone in a coffee shop, and they were talking all about how even though they had lifted the mask mandates, they still wanted to wear a mask, and they were going to keep doing it. When they went into stores, they would wear a mask and stuff. I mean, so some people love their slavery, and what can you do about that? They've been predispositioned through the media to be a slave through the whole culture, because supposedly if you behave as a slave, you'll get the best pet treats. And, and you get to basically pretend to virtue signal and all the rest. So then that needs to be broken in the culture, because those people are living under an entrainment delusion, and it's deep, deep in the media. And it takes shows like this to shock that system and bring people back to an awareness. And I think somebody like that, like the woman I listened to talking about the mask thing, she'd probably go, listen to 5 minutes of this and go running, screaming out into the street, because that dose of reality is really tough against all the entrainment. I think it would, create a situation where her head would blow up like scanners.
Yeah, that's something. I mean, we always talk about the emperor's new clothes, and but they never focus on the people who were going along with it, right?
True.
That is kind of a missing component of the story. They all just laugh.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is,
if they weren't ashamed,
right,
and went in hiding.
Right. They actually were going along with it, and that's part of the treachery. See, the thing is, let me tell you something about this that's tricky too, that I see all the time, is when people don't agree with each other, there can be a mean-spiritedness, even if you're right, that's not appropriate. So for example, there's so many people that have been brainwashed by the media that are thinking very stupid things, yeah, let's have a nuclear war, like incredibly dumb things like that are being sprayed in headlines. Like, what would it be like to have a limited nuclear war? Maybe it'd be good for global warming.
Yes,
that was in the Huffington Post. Okay. I kid you not. I almost printed it out for tonight, but it was too depressing. So, when people believe things like that, when they're, I don't want to criticize them. What I want to do is wake them up. I don't want them to be in that state where they're subject to MSNBC and the war profiteers behind the scenes that want to basically extinguish any original thought in their minds. I'd like for them to wake up. They don't have to think exactly like I do, but I can see when people, I don't know, this is a weird thing that I've been lucky to do, and so many of us here in the Ideas Room have this ability. I seem to have the ability to see when mind control is active. I've always had that, when somebody's being programmed somehow, I've always had that ability to see it. And what I would prefer to do is I don't want to lord that over anybody. What I want to do is help them wake up. And I don't want to take it from a position of, I know how to be awake and you don't. I want to take it from, let's be sensible. You're being brainwashed and entrained by a very powerful technology and war machine. And that's really, I think, where it's coming from.
Actually, when you really get down to it, what this is about seeing each other as brothers and sisters, right? And so when we look at war, right, this is the holistic question. So much of, they've made us war with each other. How are we ever going to overcome the big war with a capital W, right? If we can't resist the urge to war on these lower levels, in traffic, at the cafe, wearing masks, not wearing masks, right? The war is right here, daily, moment to moment in our daily lives.
Absolutely. And well, when I think about Steiner's work and what he says they're building up to, is the thing that they are building up to is what he calls the war of all against all.
Aha.
And this is where they're headed. And he said that the end result of that kind of harmonic activity is that the right side of the body turns against the left side of the body. Think about that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Going deep here in episode X series 121. This is Atlantean DNA, and we went all into Cayce and the automatons, the things, the Belial group and their activities in ancient Atlantis, and the incredible high technology and the really radical things that Cayce was saying about the Amilius group and the Two-Eyes Stone and the technology the Atlanteans possessed. We're going to be taking some more of your questions, and I also want to remind you, in 2 weeks we're doing our fourth year anniversary of the X Series show. It's a two-parter, and it's going to be on March 18th, which is a Friday. And so not next week, but 2 weeks from tonight. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so on that note, Steiner to God says, Steiner talks about the war of all against all, humanity splitting to a moral and an evil race in distant future. Could Ahriman have sped up the original timeline so it happens now? What about this timeline business?
There's no question. I'll tell you some of the things that we need to remember in relation to what Steiner's work, like Cayce's work, is like they're looking out and seeing all the potential for humanity. But they're placed there by the mystery schools to give us something, to help us. It's like, here's something for when this comes up. Because in Steiner's case, what he says is, humanity can actually benefit from confronting Ahriman and taking from Ahriman and from that experience a greater awareness, facing the temptation. But if we come upon Ahriman unawares, then the potential for throwing off our entire spiritual evolution is very high. And there's a whole cosmology associated with it, but in Steiner's cosmology, we're moving towards what he calls the warmth of Vulcan, which creates new Jupiter, which is the next phase of humanity. And what the Ahrimanic forces are trying to do is detour and reroute that into something he calls the eighth sphere, which is very much like the metaverse, that whole thing about sucking into a virtual reality, which projects your consciousness, and actually it attracts your consciousness away from your body. Now, and when you hear people like Musk and things like that, and the terrible experiments that he's done to try to create this implantable, Neuralink in your brain, really sick stuff. And what I want to say about this is that's the front line of the transhumanism, and the Ahrimanic battle between humanity, involves the technology. I'm very deep into technology. I've always appreciated it. I was a tech magazine editor.
You built computers.
True. Mm-hmm. I was a tech magazine editor for 10 years. And so I have a sense for the power and what's capable of it. So I'm not saying we should all be Luddites or anything like that. I'm just saying that we need to retrain the people that have the power over the technology. We need to somehow balance that situation and we do it, I think, by not being addicted to it to start with. I think that's very crucial. So just to round all that out, I think the way that I would look at what we need to do in the future and what Steiner was getting at in relation to Ahriman is not to run away from it. The idea is to engage it consciously and not sort of fall into it and say oh, I love this virtual reality thing and I'm going to suck into that and not consider the costs to it. They're creating a false paradigm. And so in Steiner's cosmology, when you go into that eighth sphere, what happens? Instead of going through the normal spiritual evolution and coming back to Earth and reincarnating, you go through the eighth sphere and then come back, which makes you a course, it makes you kind of a thing, an automaton. And when one of his weirdest comments about the eighth sphere is he said, when people go into the eighth sphere, they disappear, because that's basically what it's doing, is it's sucking in your attention and it's sucking you into a false reality. So we always need to have that ability in any situation to have situational awareness on a spiritual level. And that's a very heavy concept, but this is dark journalism, and we go deep on the esoteric side to try to get to those types of answers, because we need those tools in this era. This is exactly the time to employ those types of things. Yes.
David Tormita. If a human soul passes from a living human body upon death into a metaverse projection, then you become what they call the ghost in the machine, like the traps in Ghostbusters.
Wow. Well,
what say you?
That's pretty appropriate, I would say.
You would agree with that?
I think that, the idea, so much of the technology is new. So the ability to project your consciousness and things. We've always had those weird stories in the past about people getting trapped, their souls being trapped and things like that. People making a deal with the devil, things of this nature. So this concept has been there. What's strange about the eighth sphere, and I've done shows on this with Gigi Young, who's doing remarkable work now, and we're going to have her back really soon. And I highly recommend Gigi's work in this environment as well, because she has the incredible ability to look out from the spiritual psychic angle and give us some things to work with. But something about that eighth sphere, which I think we're exploring on this program, is you find out that Steiner said it was a mystery school secret that wasn't going to come out. It's actually a very well-guarded mystery school secret. And there's somebody named A.P. Sinnott who, through Theosophy, wrote about it and ascribed its position to the moon, which is just totally wrong, according to Steiner. And you think to yourself, eighth sphere, moon, what is all this stuff about? I think the way that we can think of it as the virtual reality environment controlling our consciousness is a kind of a central soul violation. And it leads to a place where your consciousness gets enticed outside of what you're supposed to be doing as a sovereign individual spiritual being. So there's a great threat with that virtual reality for the people who are controlling it and creating it, because in Steiner's cosmology, the Ahrimanic forces are there to suck humanity in because they like ruling over them, and they like wars, and they like these different types of things. So the only way to get out of that is to raise our own awareness level and to engage with our own spirituality against it. So that is a huge process. That's spiritual science. It's in the Cayce work, it's in the Gurdjieff work, it's in Theosophy, it's in Anthroposophy. So I think the foundation of it is there in those spiritual mystical texts. And so we have a foundation to work from. But I would say that the eighth sphere is very much a 21st century problem. And this is where we find ourselves. When you see people walking around sucked into their phone, and I don't mean just kind of looking at their phone and checking a message. I mean in that thing. That's dangerous. The video games, I think, suck your consciousness in the same way. And you can actually feel the person leaving their body if you are sensitive enough. Yes.
M. Leland says, Daniel, you can't keep us hanging. Tell us more about the right side fighting the left side of the body.
Whew. Let's think about that, huh? Well, when Steiner talks about Ahriman, it's very significant for us, I think, because he talked about tuning in to Ahriman in order to sculpt this incredible sculpture that I don't have it here, but I've shown it before, and it's terrifying even as a picture. But that Ahrimanic sense, and what happened was he felt like he was becoming encased in concrete. And he had a friend who was telling him about a near-death experience and said that he encountered something like Ahriman, and he felt like he was in granite. And Steiner went on to say that the Ahrimanic force would like to see the Earth in a gigantic deep freeze because the heaviness of the environment would suit it very well. Ahriman is a force that is an evolutionary companion of the Earth. It injected itself early into Earth's evolution, and it's something that must be engaged in a sense. It's like facing the dark side in that sense. And so we really find ourselves in the middle of that. But the Ahrimanic force is going directly, it's kind of like it's going directly for the takeover of humanity. And so the ultimate war is the war inside the individual. So you have the war of all against all, and then where do you go from there? You take the individual itself and set it at war against itself. So in this fashion, the Ahrimanic force is able to maintain and propagate its rulership over humanity. That's coming directly out of spiritual science. It's like you can accept it or reject it, but I will say that Steiner's opening up on this subject seems like a real gift for this time. And every once in a while you look around and you say, there's a few things that seem to have come out and come down to us, which we haven't really fully understood from the mystery schools. And I would say the Enneagram in the Gurdjieff work is one of them. Steiner's eighth sphere, for sure. Cayce's work on Atlantis. This is a field of inquiry they've given us. And it's kind of like, accept it or reject it. And I feel like there's something very powerful waiting for humanity the more the word gets out about this, which is why I love the conversations here in the Ideas Room. Yes.
I love this. Mitakuye Oyasin. Does DJ find it as interesting as I do that the Atlantean DNA haplogroup is designated X in the scientific literature?
Haplo X, yes. And we should say this in terms of like the strict science of it. Steiner said the Atlanteans were the red race. So they were the Native American race. And that the Iroquois nation were the ones who maintained the actual direct lineage of the Atlanteans. And I'm sure other native groups as well, but he pointed specifically to them. I find this fascinating, as I also find fascinating the fact that the Mormon story comes out of that, upstate New York area, where again, this mix with the Iroquois, the North American ruins in that part of the world. There's something interesting about all that to me that says this culture. Remember that Atlantis was around for many thousands of years. So the Belial group fought with the Amelius group for thousands of years. And their lifespan, according to Cayce, was very long too. They would live 1,000 years. So that's remarkable too. Think about the things you could accomplish in 1,000 years, right? And considering the average lifespan is 80 years old? I mean, so we're looking at an entirely different type of setup of culture that happened over many thousands of years. So that echo, when it just goes away and humanity forgets about it, when it starts to reawaken, something dramatic is going on. Yes.
Also, David Tormina, DJ, with Melinda Gates coming out to say Epstein was,
Yeah.
quote, more evil than the devil, and the reason why she had to leave Bill, is this a signal that part of the deep state wants to stop these crazy DNA projects?
I think it's a signal that they want to stop getting caught.
Well, she doesn't want to go down, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Look, there's always been a split there, and I'm gonna describe it to some weird people. You ready? George W. Bush and Bill Moyers. George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, when they did cowboy diplomacy and went in and blew up Iraq, they're doing the type of global takeover part to establish a one world government that embarrasses the other wing, which I call the Bill Moyers type. Bill Moyers was ahead of the UN. Was ahead of a series of groups, but most importantly, the Council on Foreign Relations. I know he's a journalist, and I know he's famous for a number of different things, but he has a very unusual role, including the fact that he was LBJ's presidential assistant. And it has a kind of a dark political background before he came out and became a journalist exposing this stuff, including a very interesting documentary series called The Secret Government in the late 80s. That group wants the same thing as the cowboy diplomacy group, but they don't want to get it through those means. The CFR wants that total control, but they don't want to be embarrassed publicly by it. Remember, so many of the eugenicists behind that war machine during World War II, they all wanted the same things that Hitler wanted. They wanted to lay all this stuff out, but they were incredibly embarrassed by Hitler and the death camps and all the things that happened there with him turning against them. So, but these people are coming from the same place. Those are two different wings, two different branches of that deep state. And one of them likes the shock and awe value, and they think, forget about you other guys, we know how to do this. And Schwab is actually in that group, in my opinion. I think it was part of the shock and awe of the COVID op. But I think the other side is a very steady group, and the original Bush 1, for example, had that slow, steady, will accumulate everything before anyone knows about it. They don't like, just like the Rockefellers didn't like to play it out big. They don't like everyone knowing what they're up to. This new group, the tech takeover group, are very different. They actually want you to know that they're the boss and that they're taking over and there's nothing you can do about it. They think because we have the technology, you can go to hell. This is where I think they're wrong, and only time will tell. But I think that's where they overplay the hand. I think just before the Ukraine piece came in, the COVID thing was about to collapse completely. And it is already, they're getting rid of all the stuff, getting rid of all the mandates and everything else. But I think it was going to be an incredible come down. So this thing came in and saved them dramatically. Yes.
CaritasTarot.com. DJ, if you get force implanted and don't agree, can your soul still be with God?
Your soul can be with God no matter what. All right. So, I mean,
with God, anything is possible.
Well, yeah, there's
Period.
nothing can separate you from your spiritual center. Cannot happen without you acquiescing to it. But what you're saying is very interesting because, of course, the type of injection that you're talking about is meant to have an impact on you spiritually. So I understand where the question is coming from. I always feel like there are solutions coming out. The more we know about the types of things that are being created in that pharmaceutical Frankenstein, the more we're going to be able to deal with it. Unfortunately, there's a great trail of death associated with it, just like with the wars. So you can see there are certain points in life where having kind of better awareness might help you get a better job. It might help you get, the right situation and career in your life. But there are other times where it actually saves your life. So isn't it remarkable that the more we craft this intuition and the incredible gifts of that spiritual connection, it's an incredible impact it can make in a person's life. So it comes down to a series of choices, and I think about it. Sometimes I'll read stories about people who became drug addicts and things like that, and it took incredible strength to come back from that. And I always think to myself that it's all about the right choices, and making the right choices. So, but certainly, I think if you choose God, who's going to stop you? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. This is X Series 121, going deep in this episode on Cayce and the Things, but we're going to go deeper still. We're going to take a few more of your questions, and I want to remind you, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for that newsletter that we have that keeps us both in touch. It's a free newsletter, and it's really going to help us in the future with all the topsy-turvy activity on social media. So we're really hoping that you'll stand up and be counted and join us there. And we have some exciting things coming up for you, including this question from Miss Sylvia Wings Girl.
Steiner the God again. Steiner said Ahriman will incarnate in this time and offer to humanity clairvoyant abilities without having to do the work.
Bingo.
How do you envision that? Is it AI, Meta, Neuralink?
Wow. Well, that is a really amazing question. And you're right. That's one of my very, very favorite enigmatic quotes from Steiner, which is, he will give each individual clairvoyance. But then he talks about how that clairvoyance will differ one to the other, and how this becomes the state of confusion. It's kind of a Tower of Babel situation. Now, listen, when I was studying how Nixon was putting out a UFO documentary in the early 70s, there's a guy who was the director of that, who said he was invited to the Pentagon, and they walked him around, and these guys were doing different things. But in one room he saw in 1972 a person walking around with basically electrodes behind their ears. And
I don't think I know this story.
They were connected up to a gigantic full screen TV, like kind of full screen TVs that you see now. And they were trying very hard to picture things. So they would picture a bird, they would picture a ship, they would picture these different things. And those things that they were picturing were showing up on the screens. This is his account, that the things they were doing in the Pentagon in 1972. That's 50 years ago. So have you ever noticed when you're looking at Facebook or one of those awful things that suddenly something you're thinking of will actually pop up on that screen as an ad? I have no doubt that they are starting to implement that ability for this technology to reach into the deeper levels of your thinking. And, I think some of the horrible projects they're doing, like Neuralink, and, that's pure transhumanism. And I think that they might be able to achieve some of that telepathy that way. But this is the upside down world. Again, learning about telepathy, learning about psychic experience, these should all be sacred experiences, good experiences, even common experiences for all of us. Instead, they're turning it into this freak show. And as soon as they roll out that, which I'm sure they've been working on for years, while on the surface saying, oh, that's ridiculous, astrology is ridiculous, psychic experience is ridiculous, at an official level, and kind of making it a joke, they've been working on it heavily in the background. Look, in 1964, the CIA on record infiltrated the Cayce Institute to find out about the Hall of Records. What does that tell you? So it's a deep suggestion by Steiner that what Ahriman is going to do through the technology is give everyone the ability to be psychic with their machine. And that there will be kind of a machine psychic interface. And that it's extremely dangerous because, in fact, to achieve that type of natural clairvoyance takes the kind of work that protects you when you go into those realms. Really interesting. Yes.
Fuber Fighter. Again, I ask the question, does freedom make men bad or good?
Well, they're born to be free. humanity is born to be free. So I don't, the idea of too much freedom, when somebody suddenly, like you see those incredible lottery winners, right? And very often their lives go down hard. You could say that's too much freedom for somebody, or they weren't able to handle it. But I think in general, as a thing, freedom is far preferable. And, it comes down to individual choice. Again, how much do you let yourself get away with in relation to that? So it would have to be about your own personal discipline. So it's a real variable question. But in terms of the society as a whole, freedom is always better, because the system that tries to lock people in and take away their freedoms, we've seen the kind of small minds that run that. And we've been living with them and the horrors. Look at the 2 years that they've just put us through. So unfortunately, we don't have the kind of leadership that we can turn our freedoms over to. We're born free, and we have to kind of defend that freedom at all costs, because our children's freedom is involved and humanity's fight for freedom is involved. So it's not just us.
And
Yes.
I think ultimately freedom, it doesn't make men good or bad. It makes men. Do you know what I mean? It's like, how do you actually become a true human being, like in the Native American sense, right? It's true freedom of choice, and reflecting on your actions and the consequences of your actions. Eventually, you will certainly choose good.
Yes.
And you will grow to become a true man.
Yeah. If you force somebody to be good, then they're not growing and you're not growing. Right? What's the point? Because if you're just being good to satisfy somebody else, that you're not growing as an individual.
Well, let's face it. Like, is Bill Gates a man? I'm sorry. He's who are these? All of these. The usual suspects.
Of course not. He's the devil.
No, he's. I see them as overgrown boys, right? They're playing games. They're playing games with people's lives, right? Mm-hmm. King of the mountain. It's as immature as you get. So they're just overgrown boys.
Yeah.
Irresponsible.
Well, they're undeveloped worms, is what it is. It's a little different. All right, go for it.
Okay, Jack. Question for DJ. Edgar Cayce mentioned as Rata priest in Atlantis. Was he on the Belial group that was creating clones for sex and as toys? Dark side? Of course, no. You
mean Rata?
Rata. No. Explain Rata.
Well, Rata is an incarnation of Cayce as a high priest in Egypt. And he had come from the Caucasian mountains, and it's called Carpathia. It's actually the mountain range between Iran and Russia. And it's quite interesting because this group that comes in with Rata, they are an invading group into Egypt. And Egypt, there are only 900 individuals, but they're so fierce that Egypt's king says, "Look, I don't want a bloodbath. You can take over, but we're going to kind of work out the details." And Rata becomes a liaison. Rata is part of this party. And there's a reason why they come in like this. Now, Rata is regarded as basically a freak by this group. And his mother is a daughter of Zu, and he doesn't have an earthly father. This is the way that Cayce describes him. He never just says who his father is. So it makes you wonder, basically, about his mystical creation. But Rata is basically this incredible mystic that they listen to his visions. And he said, there's going to be a great destruction, and Egypt is going to be the center of culture. We need to go there, and we need to prepare. And that's what they do. And his appearance is interesting, too, because he doesn't have any hair, and he kind of glows a little bit, and he is a very pure individual. So what happens is they establish themselves in Egypt, and then he goes to Atlantis for 25 years and works with the initiates in Atlantis while it's going down to figure out where the records are going to go. And one of those initiates is Hermes, who comes back with him and lays out the Giza Plateau. And one of the interesting things about the Giza Plateau in Cayce's story is he says they have to do archaeology to find the perfect spot. And apparently there on the Giza Plateau, 50,000 years earlier, was a great temple. So it's already in 10,500 BC, an archaeological hotspot, which is very interesting. What is going on with that plateau that it's just the center? And even the fact that the pyramids are there, just incredible. But in any case, Hermes is Thoth in Egyptian mythology, or Tahuta, as some people call him. But it's very interesting because the whole thing comes down about Hermes' emerald tablets and all this. And this is all connected with the original Ra-Ta activity. So Ra-Ta, when he's banished from Egypt, goes to Ethiopia and lives in the mountains. And he makes all the calculations, basically. He goes into a higher state. He regenerates his body. When he comes back, he's young. When he left, he was an old man. So he comes back to Egypt, and he has calculated the positions with Hermes to make the Giza Plateau. And so he gives us this incredible gift of the Hall of Records and this incredible spiritual center. He also created the Temple Beautiful in Egypt, which is where the things went to get a full soul by creating a full, real endocrine system. So, he has an incredible impact on humanity. When he comes back as Edgar Cayce, again, here we are talking about the work. This is the same thread over 10,000 years. So I think that there's something special there in relation to his work, and he's definitely in the Amelius line, not the Belial line. As a matter of fact, it's the Belial line that gets into Egypt and gives so many problems that they actually ban Ra-Ta for 40 years, and he has to leave with his following. Yes. Interesting story, by the way.
Nice Light 80. Were the Mayans and the Egyptians the only Atlantean outposts, or were there others? And Laura is asking, what about Carmen Bolter saying Java was Atlantis in your interview with her?
Hey, look, Carmen went everywhere looking for Atlantis. And what we need to remember is that on the Asian side, there's a huge piece of Mu and Lemuria that was in the Pacific that migrated into Asia. And on the Atlantean side, a lot of the Atlanteans went to India. That was another one of the outposts that they went to. But America was a real heavy-duty dead center place for the Poseidian part of Atlantis, which is the really spiritually advanced, technologically advanced piece. They all migrated up to America. The island that was Og in the Cayce readings was off of South America, and they migrated into Peru. So Peru, Central America, the Yucatan. The Yucatan is a major center that Cayce suggested, but he also suggested that they went and became the mound builders in Ohio, in Mississippi, and then some went as far as Arizona and Utah and over that way. And we have very unusual stories. If you go up to Western Pennsylvania, for example, you have stories of these groups that were not like the Native Americans, that they were Caucasian groups that were giants, that had huge walls, walled off cities. So there's a lot of echoes of things that took place. And one of the things about the Book of Mormon, I think that's interesting, is they try to tackle that. They try to fill in the blanks of what happened with those groups fighting each other. And, the motivation behind the Mormon church is a little bit different in a way from what's laid out in the Mormon. So I'm able to separate it when I look at it. But there is something very unique about America. I think there's a secret about America in relation to Atlantis that is still not come out. We've heard about the incredible finds of the Isis temple in the Grand Canyon, and how this was covered up very quickly. And of course, we've heard that there were temples, Egyptian temples, that were right near where the Bimini Wall was found, and that the locations are being kept secret. So there's a lot of things I think we're going to learn, and I think we're in that window of the stuff coming up, and it's pretty exciting. Yes.
CT, in the same vein as the Eye of the Sahara part of Atlantis. You think so? It's not Atlantis per se, but an outpost.
Yeah. No, this is what happened. That site was originally discovered in 1974. A lot of people aren't aware of that. And so someone did a really interesting analysis on it. And they got everyone buzzing about that. And it is a fascinating site. Cayce had said that the group that was migrating, one of the groups that migrated out of Atlantis, of course, some of them went to the Pyrenees. And so we get that echo of the Basque culture, which doesn't make any sense. Compared to the other cultures. Their language is different, their appearance is different. So we have a lot of different migrating Atlantean. It's like a central advanced culture that, as it goes down, there are all this egress of peoples. But I think the Sahara site is fascinating, and it apparently is, again, another attempt by that Atlantean culture to raise up something else. It's not central Atlantis. It's definitely a fleeing group. Let's be clear. Plato was very specific about where Atlantis was. He said you go out past the Straits of Hercules. That's the Atlantic Ocean. And, all the mystery schools give us that location. And Poseidia, which is this very spiritual, dynamic, high-tech end of Atlantis, and probably the dominant piece at the end, that's the part that was in the hot zone. So that's where we get the Bahamas, Yucatan, Florida piece. Yes.
Cold Aussie.
By the way, Carmen's work is really advanced. Maybe we're going to get a chance to look at her New Atlantis documentary. There's some people who are working on that. I would love for her last work to come out. So I'm hoping that it does. Yes.
Okay, Cold Aussie. Question. Does Daniel think that there was a second Atlantis either before or after the one we are discussing? I believe that there was one before Earth changed into 3D bodies, etc.
No question. Cayce talks about cultures that were lost. And he speaks a lot about them in relation to Central America. I do believe that there are cultures that were contemporary with Atlantis that are advanced that we just don't know who they are. But I will say this, that I think after Atlantis sank, I think there was a large landmass in the hot zone. And it's called Murius in Celtic legends. And they talk all about the incredible crystal temples that they have. I think that area is something that Polina Zalitsky, the incredible ocean engineer, found right there under Cuba, that there was a mountain range between the western tip of Cuba and the Yucatan that had been submerged for at least 10,000 years. But I think that whole area was still active. I think Bimini was a lot larger. It's interesting. You look at Bimini and it's just a very thin little area. But then you have Andros, which is huge. It's just a gigantic piece hanging out there. And you can see, if you go from the Yucatan Peninsula, I had some good maps with me. I'm going to show you some fun maps. Here's a couple of things I found. This is the wooden bird found in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Look at that. Are you saying that they didn't have flight? It's absurd. Beyond absurd. I mean, that's a plane. This is, of course, the incredible Stela at Abydos, and clearly shows advanced helicopters, tanks, ships.
I think, isn't it weird that they're trying to discredit this now?
Oh, they always try, but unfortunately for them, it was found in a temple and it was covered. There was one something that was over it, and so it was not supposed to be seen. And but it's it's on record.
Deal with it.
I mean, it is remarkable when you look at that kind of technology. God damn, that looks like Desert Storm, does it not? Let's look at some of these areas we're talking about here. So the red dots on Bimini, when we think about and orient ourselves about where we are with all this. So this whole area from the tip of Florida, Bimini, the western tip of Cuba, over here is Yucatan. That's all in the hot zone. That's the area that if you work for a government agency or a private contractor mapping the ocean floor, etc., and you see extensive ruins, you're under an NDA not to talk about it. And if you do talk about it, you can be sued, be arrested, or court-martialed if you're in the military. This is the same area that we put up in the graphic for the hot zone. That's the area. And of course, it overlaps with the Bermuda Triangle. This is the area where the two-eye stone was activated and was tuned too high and pulled the island down. And that's the same stone that was the Atlantean Power Center. So we're starting to get a handle there. When we look at those areas, that's where the readings of Edgar Cayce tell us land is rising. So we have to get our heads wrapped around that. There's land rising there. That's why we're seeing the Bimini wall and all the other things that we're noticing. It's because there's a change in the earth taking place. And if you go through the mystery school literature, you're going to find it in more places than just Edgar Cayce's work. There's land rising. And that's something that we don't hear anything about in traditional scientific papers. They're actually trained not to look at it. It's going to be huge, though, and that's a big piece, I think, where we can be ahead of the game for a change. Yes?
DG, is it possible these stones, the two-eye stones, could have been used to access another dimension / multiverse?
Yes. He actually, Cayce actually referred to them as a portal. And so I think the idea was, on the Amelius side, they would train the priestesses to get into an incredible concentrated state to be able to interface with the two-eye stone. And the idea of it as a portal means it would take them into a fourth dimensional place. That's the way he described it. I think that's very close to what you're saying. Here's a quote from Cayce talking again about the things. And he says, some, meaning these Belial scientists, brought about monstrosities as those of this entity's association by its projection and its association with beasts of various characters. Hence, those of the Styx, satyr, and the like, those of the sea or mermaid, those of the unicorn, I kid you not, and those are the various forms. Even after leaving the body of the animal, there's like a basically when they were introducing these different strains, they would have this incredible crisscross between trying to create the perfect entity or being. So like, being that could run fast like a cheetah and be strong like a lion. And they were doing these scientific experiments. And what he was saying is they're bringing about monstrosities because they're doing it in a fashion to originally with the things to have these beings that would just be basically robots that would do what they say. However, they're using human DNA to do it. Another one. The entity was the timekeeper for those that were called things, or the servants or the workers of the peoples. The entity was among those who were of that group who gathered to rid the earth of the enormous animals which overran the earth. But ice, the entity found nature, God, changed the poles, and the animals were destroyed. Though man attempted it in that activity during these meetings, 50,722 BC. So he talks about this meeting, and I think this is a crucial piece, which is there's a meeting in 50,722 BC, and everywhere they're being overrun by gigantic beasts. Sounds like dinosaurs. Well, here's what's interesting. There's a big gap, of course. Traditional history gives you 65 million BC. The dinosaurs die out. There are Cayce readings where he talks about the Atlantean scientists creating this situation. And so it sounds like he's saying they're creating the dinosaurs, but the only thing you can take from that is a la Jurassic Park. They're reanimating these beasts. And so they all gather up and they say, we're going to use the two-eye stone like a gigantic death ray to get rid of all these beasts. In fact, they try to do it, and instead it sets off a tremendous explosion in the volcanic activity of the Earth and Atlantis. And it doesn't achieve their aim of getting rid of all the beasts. But eventually what happens during that period is the poles shift, and those beasts are no longer a major problem for them. So, but that echo, that memory of the two-eye stone backfiring is around there. And then when it happens again in 10,500 BC, it takes everything down. So, it's a very dangerous technology. When we talk about nuclear technology now, and the casual way that the media is talking about, if we had a nuclear exchange and all this nonsense, it's insanity. It's just insanity. And it shows in a sense that the people that are in control of the media and the people that are in control of the establishment have now, in a sense, been possessed. And they're no longer speaking in a logical fashion. And they're either working for this cult unconsciously or consciously. But I think that there's a real parallel to be drawn from that destruction of the two-eye stone in Atlantis to what we're seeing now, where they just casually talk about, hey, let's have a nuclear exchange. Really? I don't think so. I don't think it's such a good idea. Okay.
Wendy Eater, is the concept of the Antichrist one that DJ sees as a real-world figure to come?
Yes. I think that ultimately the Antichrist is an Ahrimanic. I think that Ahriman is the ultimate Antichrist. And the reason I say that is Cayce mentions Steiner mentions three beings. That's one of those animal hybrids, of course. But the three beings that Steiner refers to as having that crucial impact on humanity are Lucifer, Christ, and Ahriman. And he separates Lucifer and Ahriman, which is very interesting because there's an extension called Lucifer Gnosis in mystery school understanding, which is different from the traditional devil. And Lucifer Gnosis is the gaining of knowledge. And supposedly what the Luciferian beings did was they gave things to humanity. So they would give them music, or they would give them art, and they would try to entice them and entice their attention away from the planet. But he ascribes more of a pure evil to Ahriman and Ahriman's intentions. So the interactions with the Luciferian beings is different than the Ahrimanic.
You know what I can relate it to? It's Art Nouveau versus Art Deco. In a way,
right. That's a really good point. But I think, fundamentally there you have the role of the Antichrist in Ahriman. I think that the Antichrist spirit has tried to come in through different individuals. I think Saddam Hussein and the whole thing that they were setting up, I think there was some sense of that. And I think there were some bad timelines that we got around that involved nuclear weapons. I think that the dangers, and I think that we've fallen off a track here and gone into another warped timeline. But I would have to say the best candidate for the Antichrist. I think the Antichrist is a spirit that can embody itself in an individual. So I would look for it.
As everyone
Yes.
knows, I was raised as an atheist.
Yes.
I really don't know the Bible well and all that. And I think if you're raised without it, you just playing catch up doesn't work. But I have to say that I've been thinking about this past week.
Mm-hmm.
That something happened within my lifetime where certainly it's true in America that America and the leaders of America used to believe in America and Americans and the people, and it was sort of working for us, believed in humanity.
Yes.
Something shifted where all of a sudden they want us dead. Okay, just to put it plainly, like they really
turned.
They turned. There's a disdain. Like, I mean, if you watch old commercials from the 80s, it's all about family values and sort of the working people, and it has a completely different
they
vibe.
want those people to be, they want them to have character, and they want those people,
and they want them to live and have healthy lives and all of that. And I think something with technology changed all this. I think the Antichrist is a spirit has infected all of us. It is an
I see what you're saying.
Anti-human idea, really, that we are a virus on the planet, that we are a parasitic creature that doesn't belong on the earth, and that sort of this is the thing that's getting out of control, that we shouldn't be here, and we should sort of we should change.
Who was that British prince who wanted to be reincarnated as a virus? Remember that?
It was Prince Philip, who just died.
Yes, yeah. That, it ties in directly with what you're saying. You're absolutely right.
But could that be, instead of a being? I mean, it's in a way, it's just it's sort of almost an egregore around the planet, right? That is infecting people, and I'm afraid it's going to infect children with this, because of global warming and the environment. This idea that to save the planet you should kill yourself, right? Because humans are the problem.
They've been doing that, actually. That is really fascinating, because the entrainment that they had, say, in the 80s, there was definitely entrainment there, but it was that's not a culture that hated its population. It was a culture that wanted that population. It wanted to control it through certain types of messaging, but it wasn't out to get it. And this one is definitely out to get it. You're right. So the question is, what makes the difference? Mm-hmm. How does that make the difference? And that is really the crucial question. I agree with you 100%. One more question, Miss Olivia.
One more. Okay, I'm going to give you a big one then, because I have tons of energy. Okay, also Steiner to God. All these questions about Adam, Eve, Lucifer, etc., are all answered in Steiner's work in a more logical way than any other I have found. DJ, can you talk about what Steiner said regarding, quote, the fall, original sin?
Yes. That's a shot of Edgar Cayce, by the way, with David Kahn in his day. I wanted to show you that, Cayce didn't live with like robes in an attic somewhere, conjuring things with a crystal ball. He had a very normal life. And he was very a man of his time. So there's a kind of humility, I think, that went with him. Steiner's version of humanity is a little different. And I would say that Steiner's very detailed, being a scholar. And so you do find levels of detail that you don't find in other mystery school teachings. So it makes a real difference. But fundamentally, the idea is that there's different groups of beings, and there are different Elohim that are in charge, and that at a certain point, some of them use this method in order to evolve the race. Some of them use the Watchers. These are the Watchers who are overseeing humanity's evolution. And some of them use techniques to speed up that evolution. For example, one of the things that Steiner refers to is the fact that Lucifer and the Luciferian beings teach man to speak too soon, so that their ability to grasp what they're saying happens after their ability to speak. He also talks about how when they are two sexes in one, that the being is totally different. It has a different comprehension of its environment. And he also says that women, when they separate male and female, that the women have memory and the men don't. The men are just sensing creatures. And so the women have the dominant role when that happens. And I find that very fascinating, because we know so much about female intuition and all these types of things. But I would say that Steiner fundamentally suggests that we've been in a series of different epochs, and that the one that we're going into now, represents a challenge. And this is something I always find interesting. You know, you look at so many different teachings along this line, and they'll say, like Theosophy will say, we're going into this great period. We're going into the 6th root race. Cayce says the 5th. But that root race has psychic abilities, and they will have a natural spiritual tendency. They'll care for the land. They'll be a better steward of the earth and all these different things. And psychic experience and telepathy will be natural for them. And I believe all this is true. The only problem is they leave out this tremendous battle that takes place. And this is where Steiner's like, yeah, we're going into a better future. But before that, you have this thing that happens. And it's the war of all against all. And it's the incarnation of Ahriman. The incarnation, physical incarnation of Ahriman, who's this dark astral being that's been kind of dogging the earth, is a real big deal. And this is the period. It is this century is he's supposed to show up. Unfortunately, I don't want to project for that. I've always had the impression that the incarnation of Ahriman would come directly through the technology itself. And I think he would show up as kind of an android of some kind. I don't see him as having a human incarnation at all. So, but in terms of Steiner's complete vision, I think it is quite remarkable. And I think anthroposophy brings so much out. But then you have the Cayce work, and the Cayce work, at times comments on Steiner's work. Someone asks Cayce, what do you think of Steiner's, Atlantis and Lemuria book? And the Cayce source said, it's correct on a trend. And he says, this is the viewing of the Akashic record through a mystic's eyes. So he's saying Steiner is seeing this stuff, but he's seeing it through his particular lens. And I think that's where we get the differences. And that's why you see some people can pick up the Gurdjieff work and really run with it and think that that's the thing to do. Some people really like the Cayce work, and some people really can lock in with Steiner's stuff. I think what's interesting is if you go back to 1875 and you see Isis Unveiled come out and published, there's nothing like that. That's by Blavatsky. There's no book like that that's available in public in 1875. And that's why I think Steiner said that at its inception, true initiators stood at the cradle of Theosophy. Like the real Western mystery school was there. And as a result, we have a very interesting situation because Blavatsky set off so much, but they did so much to thwart her when they felt she was bringing too much out, that work got distorted. And so without Steiner's picking up the torch through the work of Blavatsky, I would say, something really disastrous would have happened. We would have lost so much of that. But I think he gave us the fulfillment of that, which is why I think anthroposophy is so important. Yes.
Okay, so Luke Walker says Steiner said that Lucifer incarnated into a Chinese person previously, but Ahriman is yet to incarnate.
That's
and
right.
It's likely he will be from the West.
Oh yeah, he's going to be here in America.
Into a Western body because Lucifer incarnated into an Eastern one.
Yep.
Through Western technology, Steiner also said that China would become the last bastion of true Christianity.
Well, Steiner, Cayce and Steiner have something in common on that. It's interesting because Cayce had said that China would become the cradle of Christianity in the future. Just like he said, the hope of the world will come through Russia. So Cayce has some good things to say about these countries in the future. And what he said about America is interesting. He said that America needs to fulfill its destiny. And if we don't fulfill its destiny, then the leadership of the world will move eastward. So I hope that does not happen. I want us to fulfill our destiny to be the true beacon of freedom in the world. And I want the whole globe to enjoy that leadership. But so I would like to see us fulfill that destiny. That's true, what you said about Steiner saying that Lucifer incarnated in Asia. And the priests there were very aware of this character. Christ's incarnation had a huge impact. and the mystery of Golgotha had a huge impact on our lives and the spiritual evolution of the earth. And the Ahriman incarnation is a battle. It's the fight that humanity has to go through to obtain from Ahriman for Christ those tools for our evolution. So we face, somehow by facing Ahriman, we gain the ability to move forward on a spiritual evolutionary trend. That is the cosmology back and forth between Steiner and Cayce, and it's quite remarkable. One thing that's interesting about Cayce, when they said, when does the Armageddon start? You know, somebody was really curious about this. This is a person from Virginia coming in. There's a lot of Bible people, Christians in Virginia at the time who were very, locked into this idea of Armageddon. And he said, the Battle of Armageddon is recorded in the Great Pyramid. And he said it takes place in the air, and it's between the souls leaving from and those returning to the earth. And that's where the battle is. It's the attempt to prevent souls from incarnating into the earth who can save it. And so that's one heck of a technology. And that's something, I think, an answer that we need to all explore. And with that, Ms. Olivia,
one more question.
Yes.
Okay, occult fan. So where should someone who resonates with this sort of Cayce reincarnation information go to learn more?
Well, the Cayce readings are all available. And I would definitely, there's a remarkable book called Edgar Cayce's Story of Jesus that has the most reading excerpts in it. It's by Jeffrey First. He wrote one book, and that was it. And I always love that book because it's got the background of Jesus, but then it goes into the Amelius lifetime very extensively. So it's basically a very deep Atlantis book and also a very deep Jesus book. It's got both sides. So those readings are remarkable. So I would definitely recommend that one. But Cayce on Atlantis really, I think, holds the deep readings. And of course, you can become a member of the ARE as well. But to me, just visiting the ARE in Virginia Beach is a remarkable experience. It's highly recommended. It's probably been kind of bizarre in COVID land, but they have a fantastic view of the beach there. They have a meditation room. They have an incredible library, just great people all around. And like I said, the ARE is a great group. The only thing is, I think, in relation to the Cayce Atlantis work, they're very cautious, and they've never explored it and given it the attention I think it deserves, considering it's very important to their whole legacy and what he wanted to put forward, which was that this is important in humanity's experience, not just as a historical footnote, but it's playing out now. And this was what Steiner was getting at as well. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Hold on. I have a lot of people to thank. Okay. So Audra Warless, Nimza Flugzug, Shani Gee, Koldasi, Mark Petrie, Medley Childress, Jonathan Kiner, Eurythmias Fun, Tricky Vicky, Neck 1974, Jim Sarge 3ID, David Gilker, Stephen, Dion Williams, Roosevelt Media News, Norman Smith, Sarcastic Warlock, Global Atlantis, Wayne Peak, Michael Suter, Debbie McAdoo, Wendy Jo Davis, Daneline Herbert, Jay Liebgott, Luke Walker, CT Down the Range, and Ty Dubbins. Thank you so much for your generous donations.
That's fantastic. We really appreciate it. And of course, your support helps us go forward and do the work that we do here in the X series. And without you, we couldn't do it. The great questions tonight and the ideas from. I'm going to do a couple of shout outs myself, if I can see who's out there. Nick Malone. Oh, hey, I forgot I have that magic now. I can highlight anything. Good show, my man. I like it. Thank you very much. Jedi. Scarlet Fire's out there. Yes. Lots of Cayce books on Scribd. Oh, really? Scribd is kind of interesting for searching out things, for sure. I keep getting these notices on academia. They're like, you were mentioned in this paper in Argentina. I'd love to hear what they're saying. It's great to have Kat Goida out there. Really terrific. Pumphrey Gooch. Jimmy Keminar. Roy Story. Ray Story. Thank you, sir. Al Kiter. Brad Briggs. Josh Brown. John Maksuda. Wow. Brandy Renee. Steiner de God. What are your best shows? Thank you. It's great. You know, I have to say the questions, the ideas from tonight,
questions.
Amazing. And Olivia, a nice round of applause.
Thank
Olivia,
you.
Unbelievable job. Jack, it's great to see you out there. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Maury. See you next week. I like that. Barry, down the range. John Mutter, Karen Carpenter, Joe Dirt, Encore. Wow, fantastic group tonight. Unbelievable, just off the charts. And we will be back, as I said, we'll be back next week with a special interview, and I have a little surprise in between there. And then 2 weeks from tonight, it's the 4th anniversary of the X series episode.
And we're going to do a Friday show and a Saturday night
It's a double
show.
hitter. So you want to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's free. Get on board. And to all our subscribers, thank you very much for keeping us going on all that. If you feel like subscribing when you go to darkjournalist.com, this now is the time to do it. And we've made it very affordable for everyone to get in. The Cove channel. Wow. I like those. That's a straight up one-off. Olivia, that's the link. darkjournalist.com/s-subscribe.php. I know some people say that they want to send a check sometime as opposed to signing up electronically. You can do that at Dark Journalist, 1770 Massachusetts Avenue. Number 238, Cambridge, Mass. 02140. Thank you very much. We will be back, as I said, next week with a special interview. And someone mentioned Gigi Young out there. Of course, Gigi's doing great work. There's Olivia's. Yes, we appreciate your support. Luke Walker.
We don't yet. We would like to set that up.
Oh, there's a new version of the website coming. So that's going to be, if you're on the newsletter, you're going to hear all about that. That's going to be a big thing coming down. Sean Bruneau. Thank you, sir. You're very appreciated. We appreciate you as well. That was legendary. Thank you. Someone get this man a cold beer. I like it.
Can I sneak in one last question?
Love Olivia's avatar. Well, yes.
Okay. Al Kiter, question. I think, did I ask this one?
Which one is it?
Do you think time travel is only possible for non-organic things?
No, I think time travel is possible.
Or possible for organic things?
For anything.
For any? Do you think really? Do you believe in time travel?
Yes. Actually, there's some very interesting work by Thomas Townsend Brown and some inside anecdotes from his family that I got that convinced me that somebody experimented with it and got results. And that opens up a whole lot. But yeah, I think it's been utilized, unfortunately, for better or for worse. Thank you, Sal Lee. Josh? When am I? That's interesting. It's a good question. I think it's a question that only you can answer. Fantastic. Golden Girl? Terrific. Who else we got out there? Of course, a cult fan. Great to see you, sir. Josh Brown. Luke Walker. Right. Excellent.
We're going to have to
great group.
We're just going to have to do a Q&A show. Just all Q&A.
Yeah, we know. That's really true. We have so many things to cover. I can't believe it. I have so much even from tonight that's left over, but we'll roll it right into the next show for sure. Shane, Ravalon 1, Stickman Mike, Petunia, Grateful Gal. Just a great crowd out there tonight. It's so great to be here with everyone. I really appreciate it. We will see you all next week, maybe a surprise in between. And gear up. We're getting ready. X Series 122, 4th year anniversary. Watch out. March 18th, 8 p.m. Be there. That's a Friday, of course. And, it says end broadcasts after all, but it never really ends, as you know. And Miss Olivia, any famous last words?
Love you all. God bless.
Yes. Bye-bye. We love you.